The night was cold, but the fire crackled brightly, its warmth a temporary relief from the chill that crept up my spine. I sat by the flames, poking at the logs, watching them shift and crack under the heat. The woods around me were still, eerily quiet except for the occasional rustle of a branch in the wind. I hadn't expected it to be this quiet. Normally, the forest is full of life. The chirp of insects, the distant calls of birds, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. But tonight, it was different. It felt empty. I pushed the thought away. I was here to relax, to get away from the noise of everyday life. A solo camping trip, just me, the woods, and the open sky above. No distractions, no people, just peace. I had been hiking through the forest all day, making my way deeper into the wilderness than I had ever gone before. The trail had faded as I ventured off the beaten path, following the flow of a small creek that wound its way between the trees. I hadn't seen anyone all day. There were no other campers, no signs of any other human presence. Just me and the woods. The fire flickered and popped, casting long shadows around the campsite. The tent was pitched nearby, my sleeping bag and gear neatly arranged inside. I had packed everything I needed for a few nights: water, food, a first aid kit, and my phone in case of an emergency. I'd been in the woods enough times to know how to stay safe. But tonight, something felt off. I tried to brush it off. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. I grabbed a stick and poked at the fire again, the flames licking the wood in an almost hypnotic rhythm. But then I heard it, a snap, a twig breaking in the distance. I froze. It wasn't the wind. The wind was quiet. This was something else, something heavier. I stood up slowly, straining my ears to listen. The sound of footsteps, soft and deliberate, came from somewhere beyond the firelight. It wasn't an animal. It was too heavy, too calculated. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the darkness, my pulse quickening. The beam of light sliced through the trees, illuminating nothing but the thick, inky blackness of the forest. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. It was probably just an animal, a deer, maybe, or a bear, though I wasn't sure how common they were in this area. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I quickly glanced around the campsite. The fire was my only source of light, and it wasn't much. The darkness seemed to swallow everything else. My phone was in my tent. I could go get it, but something told me I shouldn't move. The footsteps were getting closer, slowly but steadily. I considered grabbing my knife, but it was in the tent too. I didn't want to move from the fire. It was my only safety, my only comfort. If I left it, I'd be in the dark, vulnerable. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, I thought I imagined them. I exhaled, my breath coming in shallow bursts, and sat back down by the fire, trying to calm myself. I was being ridiculous. It was probably nothing. It wasn't the first time I'd heard sounds in the woods. But then, a voice. It was faint, almost inaudible, carried by the wind or perhaps something else. A voice that didn't belong. It was distant, too faint to make out words, but enough to make my stomach drop. I couldn't explain it. The woods had always been peaceful before. Even on those rare occasions when I'd heard odd noises, they had been explainable. Animals, wind, things like that. But this was different. It was like I wasn't supposed to be here, like something was watching me. I quickly stood up again, my legs unsteady beneath me. The flashlight trembled in my hands as I swept it across the campsite. Nothing, no sign of movement. The trees stood silent, still. The firelight cast long, eerie shadows, but nothing was out of place. Another snap, closer this time. My heart raced. There was no way it was an animal. This was too deliberate. It was someone or something approaching me. I slowly backed toward my tent, my mind racing for a plan. Should I leave the campsite? No, the trail was too far, and it would be dark before I could make it back to the car. I'd have to stay put and hope whoever or whatever it was would move on. But the footsteps didn't fade. They grew louder, faster, as though the thing, whatever it was, had started running toward me. The light from the fire flickered violently, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving in the shadows beyond the reach of the flame. A figure, tall, thin, but then it was gone, or maybe it was never there at all. I didn't wait to find out. I grabbed my gear from the tent, shoving it all into my pack as quickly as I could. The flashlight in my hand felt like a tiny, useless thing against the vast darkness around me. I had to get out of here, but I had no idea where to go. The trail was miles away, and if I ran, I'd be leaving myself open to whatever this was. Then I heard something new, a low guttural sound, a growl. I froze. It wasn't an animal growl, at least not one I recognized. It was too deep, too human. The next moment, I heard heavy breathing. Slow, steady, but not mine. The air was thick with tension. Whoever or whatever was out there was close. I could feel its presence, even if I couldn't see it. I turned around, my eyes scanning the woods, but the shadows were thick and unyielding. My breath came in ragged gasps. My legs felt like jelly, but I forced myself to move toward the edge of the campsite, toward the trees. There was no way I could stay here. I bolted. My feet pounded the ground as I sprinted toward the direction of the creek, knowing that if I could follow it, I might find the trail. But as I ran, the sound of footsteps, too heavy, too close, followed behind me. Whoever it was gaining on me, moving through the trees with terrifying speed. I pushed myself harder. I had to get away. Then, as I stumbled over a root and nearly fell, I saw it. The glimmer of the creek, a few yards ahead. I darted toward it, hoping that following the water would lead me back to the trail. The sound of the footsteps had stopped. I couldn't hear anything now, just the rush of the creek and my own frantic breathing. I made it to the water's edge and crouched low behind a large rock, trying to steady my breath. I waited, not daring to make a sound, praying that whatever had been following me had given up. Minutes passed. The night was silent once more, save for the steady flow of the creek. I didn't move, not until the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon. Only then did I dare to stand up and take a cautious look around. The woods were empty. I don't know what I encountered that night. I never saw anyone, never heard another sound after that last terrifying moment by the creek. But when I finally made my way back to the car, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief, as if the threat had faded with the night, never to return. I haven't been back to that forest since, and I'm not sure I ever will. The air was damp, thick with the scent of pine and earth, the kind of smell that clings to you even after you leave. My friends and I had been planning this camping trip for weeks. It was supposed to be a fun, relaxing escape from our usual routine, away from the noise of the city and into the quiet of the woods. We had parked our cars at the trailhead, the sun still high enough to cast long shadows as we began our hike into the wilderness. The path wasn't too difficult, but it wasn't exactly easy either. The dirt trail wound through thick trees, their branches reaching overhead, creating a canopy that shielded us from the heat of the afternoon sun. With every step, I could feel the weight of being deep in the forest. There was something about it, the way the trees stood so tall and silent, that gave me an uneasy feeling. But it wasn't enough to stop me from going forward. We finally reached our campsite as the day started to fade. The clearing was perfect. A flat patch of grass surrounded by tall trees, with a small creek running nearby, gurgling softly in the background. We set up the tents quickly, the sound of the nylon rustling as we prepared our camp for the night. The fire pit was at the center, and soon, We had a crackling fire to keep us warm as the temperature dropped. The woods around us were alive with the sounds of crickets, rustling leaves, and the occasional distant call of a bird. I tried to push away the unease I had been feeling all afternoon. It was just a normal camping trip, right? We spent the evening roasting marshmallows, telling stories, and laughing. The firelight danced in our eyes, flickering off the trees. But as the night deepened, the sounds of the forest grew louder, somehow more urgent. The wind picked up, swaying the branches above us, and the crackle of the fire seemed to echo off the trees. My mind wandered. I tried to stay present, tried to push away the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. We eventually decided to turn in for the night, retreating into the tents to sleep. The forest was quiet again, but in that eerie way, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural, as if the woods were holding their breath. I tried to sleep, but it wasn't easy. The rustling outside, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot, kept pulling me back from the edge of slumber. The darkness felt heavy, and every time the wind shook the trees, I couldn't help but glance at the shadows. Hours passed, and just as I was finally drifting into a deep sleep, I heard something, a faint scraping sound. It was almost like the wind, but not quite. The sound was deliberate, slow, as if something or someone was moving around the campsite. I froze, holding my breath. The tent was too thin to offer any real protection, and my heart started to pound in my chest. I lay there, straining to hear. It was coming from the woods behind us. The noise stopped suddenly, and for a moment, everything was still again. But then, a faint whisper reached my ears, carried on the wind. It was too far to make out, but it was there. A voice, not the sound of the wind, but something different. I wasn't sure if I imagined it or if I was just hearing things, but the longer I lay there, the more I began to wonder. My breath came in shallow bursts as I turned over, glancing at the tent entrance. I wanted to get up, to check, but I was too scared. It was one of those moments where I knew I would only make things worse by going out there. I eventually fell into a fitful sleep, my dreams twisted by the fear gnawing at me. When I woke up, the sun had barely started to rise. My head throbbed from lack of rest, but I knew I had to get up. The others were still asleep, the camp silent around us. I went outside, the early morning light filtering through the trees, casting long shadows across the campsite. It looked peaceful, serene even, but something felt wrong. The air was thick, and the smell of damp earth was stronger than usual. I walked to the creek, hoping to clear my head. The water bubbled over the rocks, cool and refreshing, but the unease still lingered. I glanced around, half expecting something to be watching me. I was about to head back to camp when I noticed something odd. The ground around the tents was disturbed. There were marks, scrapes in the dirt, like something had been dragged across the ground. But there was no wind strong enough to do that. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. It was then that I noticed something else. A small, torn piece of fabric caught on a bush near the edge of the clearing. It was a pale blue, like the color of my friend's sleeping bag. I reached out to touch it, my stomach sinking. Something wasn't right. I ran back to camp, panic rising in my chest. I called out to my friends, shaking them awake, but there was no answer. When they finally stirred, I saw that they were confused, groggy, unaware of what I was talking about. I tried to explain the strange noises, the marks on the ground, but they just laughed it off. "You're probably just paranoid," one of them said. "It's a forest, dude. Stuff happens." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, something lurking just beyond the trees. As the day went on, the unease never fully left. We tried to make the best of the trip, going on a small hike and taking photos of the landscape. But the feeling of being watched never went away. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the underbrush made me jump. By the time we made it back to camp, the sky had turned overcast and the temperature had dropped significantly. That night, I decided to stay awake to keep watch. The others settled into their tents, and I sat by the fire, the flickering flames casting long, jagged shadows on the trees. The woods around me felt alive with movement, like something was out there, waiting. Every crack of a branch, every shift in the air, made my heart race. I kept my eyes on the darkness beyond the firelight, every muscle in my body tense and ready. It wasn't until much later, just before dawn, that I heard it. A soft, scraping sound coming from the direction of the creek. First, I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, and again, closer this time, the sound of something dragging across the dirt. I stood up, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to see what it was. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and cautiously walked toward the creek. The beam of light flickered, casting strange shadows on the trees. I tried to shake the feeling of dread that gripped me. There had to be an explanation for this, right? Maybe it was an animal. A bear, maybe, but it didn't feel like an animal. Felt intentional. I reached the edge of the creek, my heart pounding in my chest, and there, in the shallow water, was something that made my blood run cold. It was a series of long, deep scratches in the dirt, too deep to be from any animal. And the thing that really made my stomach drop? The marks seemed to lead in a straight line toward our campsite. I turned and ran back, my feet slipping on the wet ground. I could hear the scrape again, now unmistakable, like someone was moving just behind me. I burst through the clearing, the light from my flashlight flashing across the tents. My friends were awake now, their faces pale and confused as I rushed past them. There was no time to explain. I grabbed my things, yanking them from the tent in a panic. It wasn't until I looked up that I saw it, right at the edge of the clearing. A figure, tall, dark, and motionless, standing between the trees. I didn't wait to see more. I didn't care who or what it was. I grabbed the keys to the car and told my friends we had to leave. Fast. We didn't look back. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, a break from the grind of everyday life. I'd been working nonstop, and the thought of escaping into nature for a few days sounded perfect. The weather was supposed to be clear, no sign of rain, and the trails were supposedly well maintained. I packed up my gear, double-checked everything, and headed out to a remote site in the woods, somewhere off the beaten path, away from the hustle of others. I didn't tell many people where I was going, just a quick getaway. My plan was to hike during the day, set up camp, maybe do some fishing and just unwind. Nothing special, but it was all I needed. When I arrived, it was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that feels a little too still, but I brushed it off. It's just nature, I thought. I found the spot I was looking for near a small, shallow stream. The water was clear, cold, and running fast enough to drown out any remaining noises from the outside world. The trees around me were tall, their branches swaying ever so slightly in the breeze. The sun was high in the sky, still hours from setting, so I had plenty of time to get things ready. Setting up camp took a little longer than expected. I had trouble with my tent for some reason. The poles wouldn't fit right, and I kept feeling like I was being watched. The thought crossed my mind that it was probably nothing, maybe some hikers or wildlife, but I shook it off. Eventually, the tent was up, the fire pit ready, and the sleeping bag inside the tent was arranged just the way I wanted. That's when I first heard it. A snap, a twig breaking from somewhere deeper in the woods. I froze. I listened closely, holding my breath, trying to figure out where it came from. It didn't sound like an animal, too deliberate. It didn't match the random, unpredictable way wildlife moves. But I told myself it was just a deer, or some other animal passing through. Maybe something curious. After all, animals roamed freely out here. It wasn't unusual. Still, something about it unsettled me. I decided to head over to the stream, maybe get some water for the fire. I didn't want to stay idle for too long. As I approached the stream, I heard it again. A faint rustle from the trees behind me, like something moving or someone walking. Not like an animal, but like footsteps. That was when I realized I hadn't seen anyone else around when I first got here. There were no other cars at the trailhead when I arrived. No signs of hikers or campers. I'd chosen this spot on purpose because it was so isolated, but now it felt off. I turned around, slowly, looking through the dense woods. Nothing, just shadows and sunlight filtering through the branches. I stood still for a long moment, straining my ears, trying to catch any more sounds. But everything was still again. No twigs breaking, no footsteps. Shaking my head, I told myself to relax. I was just jumpy, that's all. Being alone in the woods for the first time in a long while made me overthink things. I took a few deep breaths, filled my water bottle, and headed back to camp. As the day turned to dusk, I built a fire. The light from the flames danced across the surrounding trees, casting eerie shadows. I hadn't planned on spending much time by the fire, but something about the growing darkness made me want its warmth and safety. The crackling of the logs filled the silence, and for a while, it almost felt comforting. Almost. I ate my meal quickly. Simple stuff, just some dehydrated food I boiled with water, and then sat back to enjoy the fire. The sky darkened faster than I expected, and before long, I was surrounded by the night. The only light came from the fire, and the only sounds were the crackles from the logs and the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. That was when I heard the third noise, the most unsettling one of all. A whisper. It was faint, so faint that at first, I thought it was just the wind. But it wasn't the wind. It was something else. A voice. Soft, just out of reach, like it was coming from behind me. But no one was there. I stood up quickly, my heart racing. I turned around, scanning the darkness around the camp. Nothing, not even the faintest shape. The trees were just trees. The night was still, but that whisper lingered in the back of my mind. It was around that time I started feeling like I wasn't alone, like someone or something was out there, watching me. The quiet was too heavy, the woods too silent. My instincts told me to leave, to pack up and head back to the trailhead. But the thought of walking through the woods at night, alone with no clear path, terrified me. So I did what anyone would do in that situation. I tried to ignore it. I forced myself to sit back down by the fire. Time passed slowly. The warmth from the flames began to feel like the only thing keeping me grounded. I decided to call it a night, even though I didn't want to. I wanted to be inside the safety of my tent, with the zipper pulled tight, away from whatever was out there. I didn't know how long I'd been lying there in the dark, staring up at the ceiling of my tent, listening to the wind rustling outside. My mind was spinning. My thoughts were all over the place. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something not quite right. And then came the knock. It was a faint tapping sound, just outside my tent. A soft knock, like someone was gently pressing their knuckles against the fabric. I lay there frozen, my breath caught in my throat. I could feel the blood rushing in my ears, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just lay there, holding my breath, waiting to hear it again. It came a second time, a little louder, like someone was trying to get my attention. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe a branch had fallen and was hitting the side of the tent. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The knocks were deliberate. There was a rhythm to them. I waited for a long time. I didn't dare open the tent, didn't dare look outside. The only thing I could hear was my own breathing, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, and that persistent, rhythmic tapping. It didn't stop. It just kept going. And then, all at once, it stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. I waited for what felt like hours before I finally worked up the courage to unzip the tent. I crept out slowly, one cautious step at a time, my flashlight shaking in my hand. My eyes darted across the campsite, looking for any sign of movement, but everything was still. The fire had long since died down, the embers glowing faintly. There was nothing, no sign of anyone.
No strange footprints.
No sounds. I sat down on the ground, trying to calm myself, trying to figure out if it had all just been my imagination. I was alone, out in the middle of nowhere. The isolation was starting to get to me. The wind picked up again, making the trees sway and creak. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, when I heard something, a faint sound from the distance. Not a whisper this time, but something more tangible. A movement. Something or someone was out there. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my pack, shoved the essentials into it, and began the long hike back to the trailhead. I didn't care if it was dark. I didn't care if I had to walk for hours. I just wanted to get the hell out of those woods. The whole walk back, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I would glance behind me, but there was never anyone there. No one in the trees, no one on the trail. Still, the feeling never left me. It was like I was being watched the whole way. By the time I made it back to the parking lot, I was out of breath, sweaty, and trembling. The car was just where I'd left it, parked near the trailhead, and I couldn't have been happier to see it. I threw my gear into the back seat, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I drove away from the woods, I couldn't help but look in the rearview mirror. I half expected to see something back there, something lurking just outside the range of my headlights. But there was nothing, just the dark road behind me and the promise of safety ahead. I never went back to that camping site. I don't know what was out there in the woods that night, but I'm sure of one thing. Whatever it wasn't something I ever wanted to meet again. It started as a simple weekend camping trip, just me and the open forest. I'd gone camping a few times before, nothing too special, but this time was different. I decided to do it solo. I felt like I needed a break from everything, from the noise, the people, the distractions of daily life. So, I packed my gear, picked a spot in the woods far from any trailheads or populated areas, and set off alone. I was in my mid-20s, not the most experienced camper, but I had enough knowledge to handle the basics. Tent, sleeping bag, some food, a few tools, and my trusty old compass. I knew the woods like the back of my hand, or so I thought. The drive out to the site was uneventful. I'd passed a few small towns on the way, the last of which was a dusty place with barely any buildings standing. The locals didn't seem to notice me, and I liked it that way. The road to my camping spot wound deeper and deeper into thick forest, far from the reach of any phones or the buzz of civilization. I was getting excited, ready for the silence. By the time I parked the car and unloaded everything, the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the earth itself. I didn't want to set up camp too late, so I quickly found a flat area near a creek. The sound of water flowing over the rocks was soothing, like nature was already easing my mind. I set up the tent with practiced hands, taking my time but still managing to finish before the light completely faded. The fire pit I'd spotted earlier was just a circle of stones, and I gathered some dry wood nearby. By the time the fire was crackling, the dark had settled in fully, the sky blanketed in stars. There was something mesmerizing about it, so far removed from the artificial lights of the city. I cooked a simple dinner over the fire, some pasta with dried meat. I enjoyed the solitude, sitting by the fire with nothing but the sound of crackling wood and the occasional rustling of leaves. The forest was alive, but in a peaceful, distant way. As the night deepened, I sat by the fire a little longer. The quiet was almost too much to bear, but in a good way. It felt like the woods were pressing in on me, yet at the same time, I felt free. It was pure isolation. I watched the flames dance, my mind wandering from one thought to the next, and eventually, I drifted off to sleep inside my tent. The first night was uneventful. I woke up to the sound of birds, and the daylight filtered through the trees. I stretched, unzipped the tent, and stepped out. The world was crisp, the air filled with the smell of wet pine needles, the kind that only comes after a heavy dew. The creek was still running smoothly, the water clear and cold. I cooked breakfast, oatmeal, some dried fruit, coffee. The day stretched ahead of me, bright and full of promise. I planned to hike a bit later, maybe find a good spot to take some pictures. But for now, I was content just being there. As I set off for my hike, I had a sense that something wasn't quite right, though I couldn't put my finger on it. It wasn't a feeling of danger, but more like a subtle unease, a whisper in the back of my mind telling me that I didn't belong here, that the woods weren't as welcoming as I thought. I ignored it, chalking it up to the isolation. I hiked along the creek, keeping my eyes peeled for anything interesting. It was the kind of forest where you could lose yourself without realizing how far you'd gone. Everything seemed normal. The trees were tall and sturdy, the birds were singing, and the creek babbled in the background. But after a few hours, I noticed something strange. The trail had changed. I'd been following the creek, and at first it had been clear where I was going. But now it seemed to twist in unexpected ways. There were no more landmarks, nothing familiar. My stomach tightened slightly as I stopped to check my compass. The needle wavered. I glanced up at the sky. The sun was still high, but the woods were beginning to feel thicker, the shadows deeper. I took a deep breath, convinced I was overthinking it. I'd gotten turned around before, it wasn't anything to panic about. But then I noticed something that made my skin prickle. There were no animal tracks on the ground, no signs of life, no birds flying overhead, no squirrels rustling in the trees. It was unnervingly silent. I could hear my own breathing, my own footsteps on the forest floor, but nothing else. I walked for another hour, constantly checking my compass and trying to reassure myself that everything was fine. But the woods just kept growing more oppressive. The trees seemed closer, the shadows darker. It was like the forest had swallowed me whole. Finally, I decided to turn back. It was foolish to wander so far from camp, and the growing unease was starting to gnaw at me. I retraced my steps, trying to remember the landmarks I had passed earlier. But the more I walked, the less familiar everything felt. The trees looked different now, twisted and gnarled, their trunks bending in unnatural ways. Panic began to rise in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. I checked the compass again. It was still pointing in the wrong direction. I was lost. I tried not to panic, but my heart was pounding in my chest. How could I have gotten so turned around? The forest seemed to stretch on forever in every direction. I tried to call out, hoping someone might be nearby, but the words felt hollow in the vast emptiness of the woods. The silence seemed to swallow them. I kept walking, hoping to find a familiar trail or at least a spot where I could get my bearings. But it was no use. The forest had swallowed me whole, and I was helpless to find my way back. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky when I finally gave up on the idea of finding the camp. The last light of the day was slipping away, and the shadows in the woods were becoming long and dark. The temperature dropped, and I felt a chill in the air. My stomach growled, but I didn't have time to eat. I needed to focus on finding shelter for the night. I found a small clearing and decided to set up camp. I built a fire quickly, using the last of my matches. The flames flickered and danced, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch into the forest. I sat by the fire, my mind racing. I wasn't sure what to do. I knew I needed to find my way back to the car, but I couldn't afford to get lost in the dark. The fire crackled and popped, and I forced myself to eat some of my remaining food. I tried to keep calm, telling myself that I would be fine, that I just needed to wait until morning. But the longer I sat there, the more the forest felt alive. Not in a peaceful way, but in a menacing, oppressive way. The shadows were darker now, and the sounds of the forest felt like they were getting closer. I heard something moving in the underbrush. It was too far away to make out what it was, but it sounded like something big. My heart skipped a beat, but I told myself it was just a deer or maybe a bear. I wasn't in any real danger. But the sound came closer, the crack of a branch underfoot, the low rustling of leaves. My breath quickened as I stood, trying to make myself as small as possible. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but I could hear it, something moving through the trees, just outside the circle of light cast by the fire. For what felt like hours, I sat frozen, my eyes darting from one shadow to another. The fire seemed to be the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. But I knew it wouldn't last forever. I needed to sleep, but the thought of closing my eyes with something, or someone, out there was terrifying. I don't know when I finally fell asleep, but it was a restless, uneasy sleep. The fire had burned low, and the forest outside my small shelter felt even more threatening in the dead of night. I kept waking up, listening for any movement, every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves making my heart race. When I finally woke up the next morning, it was with a sense of overwhelming relief. The sun was rising, and the forest didn't seem quite as oppressive. I felt a little foolish for having let my imagination get the best of me the night before. I packed up my camp quickly, eager to get moving, to get back on track. The fire was nothing more than a pile of smoldering ash now, and the woods looked much more inviting in the light of day. I kept walking, and this time, I paid closer attention to my surroundings. The landscape began to look more familiar as I retraced my steps. The dense trees started to thin, and after what felt like hours, I finally broke through into a small clearing, and there, just beyond it, was my camp. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as I saw my tent, the fire pit, and my gear. The woods didn't seem so threatening now, just a little quieter than I remembered. I packed up quickly, ready to leave the woods behind. I had made it. Against all odds, I had found my way back. I don't know how, but I was out of the woods, and as I drove back toward the nearest town, I couldn't help but feel that strange sense of peace again. The forest had been silent, and it had seemed endless, but I had survived. There had been no ghosts or creatures in the woods, just the overwhelming, terrifying silence of a place that had almost swallowed me whole. As I drove away, I promised myself I would never forget the lesson. Sometimes the quietest places are the most dangerous. It was supposed to be just another weekend in the woods, a break from the noise and stress of the city, a few days to recharge, escape the constant buzz of phones and emails, and just enjoy the quiet of nature. It was meant to be a peaceful trip, me and my brother, Mark, out in the wilderness. We'd done this before plenty of times, setting up camp, hiking, cooking over an open fire, the whole deal. Nothing too complicated. Just two guys who wanted a few days of solitude in the woods. But this time, something felt different. It started as a small feeling in the pit of my stomach, a low hum of unease that I couldn't shake. I didn't tell Mark, of course. Why ruin the trip with my weird, irrational thoughts? It was just the woods, after all. Nothing out of the ordinary. We parked the car at the trailhead and unloaded our gear. The forest was quiet. No birds, no rustling of leaves in the wind, just stillness. Mark joked about how we'd probably get eaten by bears or something, but I didn't laugh. I just slung my backpack over my shoulders and tried to focus on the task at hand. We had about a 2-hour hike ahead of us to get to the spot we'd picked out, a little clearing by a stream where we'd set up camp. As we hiked deeper into the forest, the trees grew thicker, blocking out most of the sunlight. The path twisted and turned, sometimes narrowing to barely a foot wide, with roots sticking out like jagged teeth. It felt like we were stepping into some kind of forgotten world, the air growing cooler with each step, the smell of damp earth and pine filling my nose. I noticed the quietness more as we walked.
No birds.
No animals rustling, not even the wind. It was like everything had just stopped. Mark, for his part, didn't seem to mind, though I caught him glancing around every now and then, as if he, too, sensed something was off. We arrived at the clearing just before dusk, and I immediately set about making the fire while Mark started laying out our sleeping bags and tents. The sky was dimming quickly, and I could feel the temperature drop as night settled in. The flickering light of the fire cast long shadows around us, and for a moment, the unease I'd been feeling seemed to fade away. We spent the evening like we usually did, cooking simple meals over the fire, chatting about nothing in particular, and letting the warmth of the flames keep the chill at bay. But the feeling never completely left me. I found myself glancing around the edge of the clearing, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing in the darkness just beyond the firelight. Of course, there was nothing there, but the feeling lingered, hanging in the air like a thick fog. Night came fully, and we settled into our tents, the sound of the crackling fire the only thing breaking the silence. I tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't let me. I kept hearing strange sounds. Not the usual nighttime noises of the forest. This was different. A faint rustling, soft but distinct, like something was moving around the camp. I told myself it was probably just a raccoon or deer, something harmless. But every time I thought I'd heard it again, my heart would race a little faster, and my breath would catch in my chest. Mark was already asleep, his snoring faintly audible through the thin walls of the tent. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling of my tent, listening. The sounds kept coming. Rustling, scratching, almost like something was dragging itself through the underbrush just outside our camp. I convinced myself it was just the wind, maybe some branches brushing together, or an animal scavenging nearby. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped my tent as quietly as I could, careful not to wake Mark, and stepped out into the night. The fire had burned down to a few glowing embers, and the woods around us were in complete darkness. The rustling sounds had stopped, but the silence that followed was almost worse. I grabbed the flashlight from the camp table and scanned the edge of the clearing, my beam of light cutting through the darkness. Nothing. No eyes gleaming back at me, no shapes moving in the shadows, just the endless blackness of the trees. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and turned to go back to my tent when I heard something. A low thud, like a heavy footstep, coming from deeper in the woods. I froze, my pulse quickening again. I scanned the trees, my light darting from one shadow to the next. Nothing. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. My instincts screamed at me to wake Mark and pack up, to leave this place and never come back. But I couldn't do that, not yet. We had come all this way, and I didn't want to ruin the trip over a couple of weird noises. I turned back toward the campfire, but just as I did, I saw it. Something was moving at the edge of the trees, just beyond the clearing. A shape barely visible in the shadows. I froze again, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure was tall, almost impossibly tall, and it was moving slowly, deliberately, like it was watching us. I didn't know what to do. I stood there, staring at the shape, my mind racing. It was too far for me to get a clear look, but something about it felt wrong, unnatural. My breath came out in quick, shallow bursts, and I had to force myself to stay calm. The figure didn't move any closer, but it didn't move away either. It just stood there watching us. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shape melted back into the darkness. Gone. I didn't wait around to see if it would come back. I hurried back to my tent, nearly tripping over the roots that snaked through the ground, and zipped myself inside. I didn't dare look out again. I just lay there wide awake, listening to the silence. The next morning, I told myself it was just my imagination, that I had been overtired or maybe just spooked by the isolation of the woods. Mark didn't notice anything odd, and I didn't mention the figure to him. I figured it was best to let it go, to get on with the trip as planned. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were no longer alone in these woods. I had never been the kind of person to get spooked easily. I grew up in the woods, hiking and camping every weekend, exploring every inch of the forests near my home. But that night, that was different. I had decided to go on a solo camping trip, just to get away for a bit. No friends, no distractions. Just me, the trees, and the silence. The weather was perfect, crisp and cool, but not too cold, and the air smelled fresh, like pine and earth. I packed my gear into my backpack and headed out early in the morning. I had chosen a small, secluded area about 5 miles from the nearest campground. The map I had was old, but I liked the challenge of finding my way without GPS. The trail was rough, winding through thick brush and over uneven terrain. The woods were dense, and I could feel the quiet wrapping around me like a blanket, the only sounds being my footsteps and the occasional bird call. I stopped a couple of times to take in the view, the trees stretching up into the sky, the sunlight filtering through the leaves, but it felt almost too still, too quiet. There was no breeze, no rustling of leaves, nothing. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, but I brushed it off. Nature, I thought. Nature has its moods. By the time I reached the clearing, it was late afternoon. The sun was beginning to dip behind the hills, casting long shadows on the ground. I set up camp quickly, pitching my tent by a small stream that babbled quietly in the distance. I felt a bit of relief as I got my fire going, watching the flames flicker and dance. As much as I loved the solitude, it did make me feel a bit uneasy, like I was a little too far from civilization. But the fire was warm, and I had plenty of food and water, so I settled in for the night. I sat by the fire, eating a granola bar and staring into the flames. The woods around me were completely still, the kind of stillness you only get in a place where no one has been for a while. That's when I heard it. A snap, a twig breaking somewhere off to my right. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. It wasn't the sound of a deer or a raccoon. Nothing natural like that. It was too loud, too deliberate. I listened, straining to hear anything else, but the forest was silent again. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, though deep down, I knew it wasn't. The sound had been too clear, too close. I grabbed my flashlight from the side of my backpack and shone it around the campsite. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, the rocks, the tent. Nothing out of the ordinary. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself I was being paranoid. But when I went to sit back down by the fire, I noticed something. The edge of the woods, the part closest to where I had heard the snap, looked different. There was something about the shadows there, like they were deeper than they should have been, like they were moving, slowly creeping toward me. I shook my head, trying to push the thought out of my mind. I wasn't going to let myself get scared over nothing, but as the night wore on, that feeling kept creeping back. The sounds of the forest, the gentle rustle of leaves, the chirping of crickets, seemed to be fading. It was too quiet again. I felt like I was being watched. I kept the fire going and eventually crawled into my tent, trying to shut out the creeping anxiety. My sleeping bag felt warm and comforting as I lay there, staring up at the tent's ceiling. I closed my eyes, telling myself it was just my imagination. But sleep didn't come easily. Every little sound, the wind in the trees, the distant sound of an owl, made me tense up, straining to hear more. Then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it again. A sound from outside. Not a twig snapping this time, but something much heavier. Something large moving through the underbrush. My heart pounded in my chest as I held my breath, listening. It was moving slowly, carefully, like it was trying to avoid detection. But it wasn't the sound of an animal. No, this was something different. It was too deliberate, too purposeful. I grabbed my flashlight again, ready to shine it outside. But before I could even flick the switch, the sound stopped. Just like that, the woods fell silent once more. I waited, not moving a muscle, trying to control the panic building up inside of me. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe it was some animal or even another camper. But the more I thought about it, the less likely that seemed. The woods around me were so isolated. I hadn't passed anyone on the trail all day, and no one should have been anywhere near my campsite. I sat there for what felt like hours, holding the flashlight tightly in my hands, my mind racing. But eventually, I managed to convince myself that I was overthinking it, that it was just a bad case of nerves, the kind of paranoia that can come from being alone in the woods. I turned the flashlight off and lay back down, telling myself to go to sleep. But sleep didn't come. The night dragged on, and the feeling of being watched never left. I would doze off for a few minutes, only to jolt awake again, my heart racing. At one point, I even thought I heard a voice, faint, distant, but clear, as if someone was calling out my name. I sat up, my breath catching in my throat, but there was nothing. The air was still, too still. I don't know how long I lay there in the dark, listening to every little noise, every crack and rustle in the forest. But eventually, I must have fallen into a fitful sleep, because the next thing I knew, the morning light was streaming into my tent. I woke up feeling a strange sense of relief, like I had made it through some kind of test. The forest was quiet once more, but it didn't feel quite as ominous now. I quickly packed up my gear and decided to leave early. Maybe it was just a weird night, nothing more, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. As I made my way back down the trail, the air felt different, lighter, almost. The forest no longer felt like it was closing in around me, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. And I couldn't quite put it out of my mind that, when I left, I didn't hear the sounds of the forest returning. It was still too quiet, like everything had been holding its breath. When I finally made it back to the car, I took a deep breath, feeling the weight lift off my shoulders. I couldn't explain what had happened that night, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't coming back to that spot. Not ever. And maybe that's what scared me the most. The feeling that I had been so close to something out there in the woods, something I couldn't see, but which had been watching me the entire time. It was supposed to be a weekend to get away from everything. A simple camping trip in the woods. Just me and the wilderness.
No distractions. No noise.
Just fresh air, the sound of birds, and the crackling of a campfire. At least, that's how I imagined it when I packed my gear and set out for the quiet spot I had researched weeks before. The drive there had been uneventful. I took the back roads, the kind of place where your phone has no service, and the only signs of life are the occasional deer darting across the road. The woods were dense, the trees towering above me like silent sentinels. When I finally parked my car at the trailhead, I could feel the weight of the world falling off my shoulders. I grabbed my backpack, a small tent, and a few supplies, and began the hike into the forest. The trail was narrow, winding between thick underbrush and gnarled tree roots. The air smelled earthy, like damp moss and pine needles, and the only sound was the crunch of my boots on the ground. It was peaceful, and I felt a deep sense of calm wash over me with each step. The campsite I'd chosen was near a small creek, far enough from the trail that I wouldn't be bothered by other hikers. After about an hour of hiking, I found the perfect spot, clear of fallen branches and with a good view of the creek. I set up my tent quickly, enjoying the solitude. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I made a fire, the flames flickering and dancing as I sat on a nearby rock, staring into the orange glow. As night fell, the woods came alive with the sounds of the night creatures. Owls hooting, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, and the occasional splash from the creek. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way, but something felt off. It was hard to pinpoint exactly what it was. The air seemed heavier, the shadows a little too long. I shrugged it off, convincing myself that it was just the isolation, the quiet. I was used to being alone, but this felt different. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see something move in the dark, but there was nothing. I stayed close to the fire for warmth and comfort, occasionally tossing a log onto the flames. The night grew colder, and I decided to turn in early. I crawled into my tent, zipped myself in, and lay there listening to the sounds of the forest. The firelight flickered through the thin fabric of the tent, casting eerie shadows on the inside. I closed my eyes, trying to relax. Then I heard it, a soft rustling sound coming from outside. Not the wind, not the usual sounds of animals. This was deliberate, like something was moving around my camp. My heart began to race. I told myself it was just an animal, probably a deer or a raccoon, maybe. I tried to ignore it, but the rustling grew louder, closer. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent just a crack, and peeked outside. My flashlight illuminated nothing but the trees and the edge of the creek. The wind stirred the leaves, but there was no sign of anything or anyone. I hesitated for a moment before retreating back into the tent. My breathing was shallow now, my body tense. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. I had been out here alone for hours, and nothing had happened. This was just the isolation messing with me. But then the sound came again, closer this time. It was unmistakable. A soft shuffle of feet in the dirt, a rustling of leaves. I could hear breathing now, shallow and deliberate, not the normal sounds of the forest. I froze. My mind raced through the possibilities. Was someone else out here? Had I unknowingly set up camp near a hunter or some other camper? I couldn't hear a vehicle or anything that would suggest another person had come this way. The road was far, and the trail wasn't exactly well known. I grabbed a small knife from my backpack, clutching it tightly in my hand as I listened. The rustling stopped for a moment, but I could still hear the steady, almost rhythmic breathing. It was too close for comfort, too deliberate. I didn't know what to do. Should I stay in the tent, or should I investigate? The fire was out, the shadows of the trees swallowing up the little light that had been left. I had no idea if whatever, was out there had noticed me. I decided to take a chance. I crawled out of the tent slowly, holding my breath. My feet barely made a sound on the soft earth as I crouched behind a large rock near the edge of the clearing. I peered around it, shining my flashlight in the direction of the noise. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then, just as I was about to relax, a figure stepped into the light. A man, or at least I thought it was a man. He was tall, wearing dark, ragged clothes that blended into the shadows. His face was obscured by a hood, but I could see his eyes, wide and unblinking, like a predator's. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath caught in my throat. I didn't move, praying he wouldn't see me. He stood there, still as a statue, staring at the spot where I had been sitting moments before. He didn't speak, didn't make a sound. He just stood there, breathing in and out, his chest rising and falling slowly. Then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he turned and walked back into the darkness. The forest was silent again. I didn't wait to find out what he was doing or why he was there. I didn't even bother to grab my things. I didn't want to know. I ran, my heart racing, my mind screaming at me to get the hell out of there. I didn't stop running until I reached the trailhead, my legs burning and my breath ragged. The man, whoever he was, had never followed me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching. When I finally got back to my car, I didn't look back. I didn't want to know what might be lurking in those woods. I just wanted to get as far away as possible. I drove for hours, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. When I finally got home, I didn't tell anyone what had happened. It didn't seem real and I couldn't explain it. But I knew one thing for sure: I'd never camp alone in those woods again. I'd been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. Just a couple of days to myself, away from everything. No work, no phone calls, no distractions. I'd found a small, remote campsite near a quiet lake, far from any major trails or crowds. The perfect spot to unwind. The drive up had been peaceful, and I'd enjoyed the steady rhythm of the tires on the dirt road as I slowly made my way into the woods. There was no one else around, and the isolation felt almost luxurious. I set up my tent near the water, just as the sun started to dip below the treeline. The evening air was cool, and I could hear the sounds of the forest coming to life. The rustling of leaves, the distant call of birds settling in for the night. It was peaceful. I made a small fire, cooked some dinner, and sat back to enjoy the solitude. As the stars started to appear, I felt the quiet settle around me like a thick blanket. I was alone, but in the best possible way. I leaned back against a log, staring up at the sky, letting the silence wash over me. Then, just as I was starting to feel fully at ease, I heard it. A noise, soft at first, but unmistakable. A crunch of leaves, just at the edge of the woods. My body tensed, but I told myself it was probably just a deer or some other animal. I stayed still, watching the trees, waiting for a glimpse of whatever had made the sound. Nothing. I shook my head and stood up, grabbing another log for the fire. I convinced myself that it was nothing, just the wind or maybe a raccoon. Still, there was a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. The night felt too quiet, the shadows too deep. But I couldn't let myself get spooked. After all, I'd been camping plenty of times before. This was just another night. I finished my dinner and cleaned up. The fire crackled softly as I sat back down, leaning into the warmth. For a few minutes, I lost myself in the crackling sounds of the fire and the gentle sway of the trees. But then I heard it again. The crunch. Closer this time. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up quickly, scanning the dark forest. The trees seemed to close in around me, and the shadows stretched long and menacing. The firelight flickered as I tried to focus, my eyes darting around, searching for anything that could explain the sound. Nothing. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, or maybe it was just the wind shifting. But that feeling, the one deep in my gut that told me something wasn't right, refused to go away. I forced myself to sit back down, trying to ignore it, but the quiet wasn't the same anymore. It felt heavier, as though the forest was holding its breath. I decided to go to bed early. It seemed like the best way to shake off the unease. The tent was cozy, and I had enough sleeping bags to keep warm through the night. I zipped myself in and lay there in the dark, listening to the sounds of the forest around me, the occasional rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs breaking underfoot, and the wind, But something was different. The wind wasn't normal. It was erratic. It would pick up, howl through the trees, then suddenly drop to a whisper. Then the silence would return, but only for a moment before it started again. My thoughts wandered back to the noises I had heard earlier. Could it have been an animal? A bear? Maybe. I'd heard that they could be more active at night, but I hadn't seen any signs of bears on my way in. No tracks.
No droppings.
Just the peace of the forest. I shut my eyes, trying to push the feeling away, but it wouldn't go. And then I heard it again, the crunch followed by a snap. My heart raced as the noise came from the other side of the campsite, closer than before. I lay there, frozen, my breath caught in my throat. My mind raced through possibilities. Was it another camper? Or someone else? Someone who shouldn't be out here? My thoughts spun faster, but I couldn't find a solid answer. I grabbed the flashlight beside me, my hand shaking, but I didn't dare turn it on. The last thing I wanted to do was give away my position if something was out there. The noise stopped. For a long, terrifying moment, there was only silence. And then, a soft voice broke through the stillness. It wasn't a voice like a person's, it wasn't words. It was more like a whispering sound, something incomprehensible but close, too close. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the whisper seemed to swirl around the tent. It made my skin crawl. I tried to convince myself that it was just the wind, that maybe the trees were making strange sounds in the dark. But there was no denying the dread that seeped into my chest. The sound, it wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, close, and unmistakable. I held my breath, waiting. The wind picked up again, and the whispering faded for a moment. But just when I thought it might be over, I heard the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, moving around the edge of my tent. I slowly reached for my knife, tucked safely in my gear bag, just in case. The sound was too close now. I couldn't just ignore it anymore. My fingers brushed against the cold metal, and I gripped it tightly, bracing myself for whatever was coming. The tent fabric rustled as something brushed against it from the outside. I froze, waiting for the next sound, but it didn't come. It was almost worse. The silence was worse than the noise. I could feel my pulse in my ears, the tension building inside my chest. Every muscle in my body was stiff with fear. I squeezed the knife tighter, my knuckles white. Suddenly, the tent shook as something heavy bumped into it. My heart slammed against my ribs, and I had to force myself not to scream. Whatever was out there, it wasn't going away. It was getting closer, moving around the tent, bumping into the sides as if it was searching for something. I held my breath, willing myself to stay still. I had to wait for whatever was out there to move away. But the shaking didn't stop. The feeling of being watched, of something being right there, so close, was overwhelming. I was paralyzed. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The shaking, the sounds, the whispering. The forest was quiet again. Too quiet. I lay there, straining to hear any sign of movement, but nothing came. Minutes stretched into hours. It was as if the night had frozen, and the world had forgotten how to move. When the first light of dawn finally crept through the trees, I didn't wait a second longer. I packed up everything, and left. The woods were still eerily quiet, and I didn't look back once. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something watching me, something still lingering in the trees. But nothing ever followed me out of that forest. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. Just me, the woods, and the quiet. I had planned it all out. A solo camping trip to disconnect from everything. No phone calls, no emails, just me and nature. I had picked a spot in the forest that wasn't too far from civilization, but far enough to feel like I was truly away. The trail was lightly trafficked, but not enough for it to feel crowded. The kind of place where you could find a little solitude, or so I thought. I arrived at the trailhead mid-afternoon, with enough daylight to set up camp without rushing. The air smelled fresh, like pine and damp earth, the kind of scent that instantly calms you. I'd been camping before, but there was something different about this place. The trees felt thicker, the shadows darker, and the path less worn. Maybe it was because I was alone this time, or maybe it was the unsettling quiet that hung in the air. Setting up my tent was a routine I could do in my sleep, but even then, there was a tension in the pit of my stomach that I couldn't shake. I told myself it was just nerves. After all, it was just a weekend in the woods. I made sure to secure everything. The tent stakes dug deep into the ground, and I double-checked the zipper to make sure no animals could sneak in. The sun was sinking lower now, the sky turning a pale orange that quickly faded to twilight. I decided to get a fire going before it got too dark. The flames were a comfort as they crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows that seemed to stretch across the trees. I cooked some simple food, just a can of beans and some crackers, nothing fancy, but enough to keep me satisfied. As the night settled in, the quiet of the woods took over. The occasional rustle of leaves, the distant chirp of a bird, and the low hum of insects were the only sounds I could hear. But then, a snap, a loud crack of a branch breaking, followed by the soft padding of something moving nearby. My head whipped around, scanning the dark trees, but I couldn't see anything. Could have been a deer or maybe just a squirrel, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up anyway. The woods were full of creatures, but this felt different. Too close, too deliberate. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just a figment of my imagination, a product of the isolation. I turned back to the fire and tried to focus on the warmth. A few minutes later, another snap, this one closer. My heart skipped a beat, and I found myself holding my breath. I was trying to stay calm, but something about this didn't feel right. The woods had always been peaceful to me, but tonight, they felt like they were holding their breath, too. I grabbed a stick and poked the fire, trying to convince myself that I was just overthinking things. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there, watching. I stood up and grabbed my flashlight, shining it around the campsite. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees around me. For a brief moment, everything looked still, calm, as if nothing had happened. I exhaled, a little relieved. But then, in the corner of my vision, I saw something move. It was fast, just a shadow darting between the trees, too quick for me to fully process. My heart pounded in my chest, and my mind raced with possibilities. Could have been a deer, but it didn't move like one. It wasn't the wind either, there was no breeze. I stood frozen for a moment, waiting, listening. The woods had gone completely silent again, not a sound to be heard. After what felt like forever, I shook my head and muttered to myself, "It's just your mind playing tricks on you." But deep down, I knew something was off. I couldn't explain it, but my instincts told me not to ignore it. I spent the next few hours by the fire, constantly scanning the trees, trying to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. I told myself I'd get some sleep and everything would be fine in the morning. But the noise kept coming back. It was subtle at first, a rustle in the underbrush, a faint shuffle of feet. But it kept getting closer. The closer it got, the more I began to doubt myself. Was it an animal or something else? As the fire burned low, I stood up, my nerves tingling with unease. Couldn't let my guard down. Something was out there and I needed to know what it was. Slowly, I began walking toward the edge of the clearing, shining my flashlight in every direction. I didn't want to look, but I had to. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure. It was standing just beyond the reach of the firelight, barely visible in the shadows. I froze, the beam of my flashlight shaking in my hand. It didn't move, but I could feel it watching me. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I couldn't move. It was too far away to make out any details, but it was tall, and it had the shape of a person. Not a bear, not a deer, something human. My heart slammed against my ribs, and I took a step back, almost tripping over my own feet. I turned and bolted toward my tent, my legs shaking with adrenaline. I didn't know if I was being followed or if it was still standing there, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I ripped open the zipper and scrambled inside, my hands fumbling with the flap. I couldn't hear anything outside, but that didn't mean it was safe. I quickly secured the tent, holding my breath as I listened for any sign of movement. The silence pressed in on me, thick and suffocating. Hours passed, but I didn't dare sleep. Every rustle, every sound made my heart race. I kept my flashlight close, the beam flickering nervously in the darkness, too afraid to turn it off. The night seemed endless, and every minute stretched into an hour. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps around the tent, slow and deliberate. I held my breath, praying that whatever it was would move on, but the footsteps stopped, just outside the tent. I didn't dare look out, but then, finally, as the first light of dawn crept through the trees, the sounds stopped. The woods returned to their usual quiet, the only noise the soft chirping of birds. My body was exhausted, but I couldn't bring myself to leave the safety of the tent. I sat there for a long while, waiting, listening, trying to convince myself that it was over. Eventually, I gathered the courage to step outside, my eyes scanning every inch of the clearing. There was no sign of the figure, no evidence that anyone had been near, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I packed up my gear quickly, making sure everything was in order, and kept my eyes on the trees as I moved. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if something was just out of sight. I didn't want to look back, but I couldn't help it. The trail seemed longer than I remembered, the trees closing in around me like they were keeping me in. When I finally made it back to the car, I didn't waste any time. I threw my things in the back, slammed the door, and drove away without a second thought. The thing is, I still don't know what I saw that night. Was it a person? Someone lost? Someone who wasn't supposed to be out there? Or was it something else? Something I'll never understand? I'll never know for sure, but I learned a few things. The woods are full of dangers, not just the obvious ones. And sometimes the scariest thing isn't what you see, but what you can't. I don't know if I'll ever go back to those woods, but I do know this. I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, and I'll never, ever trust that uneasy quiet again. The woods had always been my escape, a place where I could lose myself, unwind, and forget about the noise of the world. That's why I loved going out on solo camping trips. I didn't need the company of others, just the crackling of the campfire and the rustling of leaves in the wind. So, when I packed my bag for another weekend in the woods, I felt the usual excitement stir inside me. I had planned everything carefully: enough food, my tent, sleeping bag, water, a map, a compass, and a few other survival tools. No tech, no distractions, just me and nature. I drove to the park, far away from civilization, to a site I'd visited before. It wasn't well known, which made it perfect. The last thing I wanted was crowds of people. I parked my car at the entrance, grabbed my gear, and set off down the familiar trail. The air was fresh, filled with the earthy scent of pine and damp soil. The sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows across the path, but it wasn't quite dark yet. I walked for about an hour before I found a small clearing near a stream. The sound of running water was soothing, and the trees here were thick enough to provide shelter but sparse enough to let the evening light filter through. This spot had a peaceful, secluded feel to it. I dropped my pack and set up camp, working quickly but methodically, as I had done many times before. Tent first, then the fire pit, and finally I gathered some dry wood for later. The sun finally set, and darkness took over the forest. I was alone now, but I didn't feel any fear. The woods weren't sinister to me. I knew them. The night was still, except for the occasional crackle of leaves and twigs under the weight of some unseen animal moving through the underbrush. I made a simple dinner: rice, beans, and some jerky. Nothing fancy, but enough to keep me fueled. As I ate, I watched the fire flicker, casting orange light on the trees around me. The stars started to shine through the gaps in the canopy above, and I felt that familiar peace settling into my bones. The kind of peace you only get when you're far away from the world. After finishing my meal, I leaned back against a tree, staring up at the sky. The fire crackled in front of me, and I began to relax, knowing I had nothing to worry about for the next couple of days. But as the minutes passed, something started to feel off. It wasn't anything specific, just a vague sense of discomfort, like the air had changed. I pushed it aside. It was probably just the quiet of the woods playing tricks on my mind. But then I heard it, a sound. At first, I thought it was a deer or maybe a raccoon, something small and harmless moving in the underbrush. But then it came again, a sharp, snapping noise, something heavy, something bigger than a small animal. My eyes shot to the darkness just beyond the firelight, but all I saw were shadows. I reached for the flashlight in my backpack and turned it on, sweeping the beam across the trees. Nothing. Could have been an animal. Probably just that, I told myself. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I tried to push it from my mind, focusing on the fire, but the unsettling feeling didn't go away. I didn't want to overreact, so I grabbed a book from my bag and tried to settle back into the warmth of the fire. But my mind kept wandering. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the underbrush seemed to pull my attention away from the pages. It wasn't until I heard a third sound that I knew something was wrong. This time it was closer. The ground beneath me seemed to tremble just slightly, and the rustling wasn't random. There was a rhythm to it. Something or someone was moving deliberately, making its way toward my camp. My heart raced as I gripped the flashlight tighter, my fingers cold and clammy. It wasn't an animal. This was different. I listened harder, my pulse pounding in my ears. The sound wasn't stopping. It was moving closer and closer, and now I was sure. Someone or something was out there. I stood up slowly, my hands shaking as I grabbed the knife from my belt. It was just a precaution, I told myself. Just a way to feel like I had control of the situation. But deep down, I wasn't sure if that would be enough. The noises kept coming from all directions now. I backed up slowly toward my tent, trying to stay quiet, not wanting whoever or whatever was out there to know that I had heard them. And then it stopped. The forest fell eerily silent. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to hear anything at all. But there was nothing. I couldn't tell if they were gone or just waiting, watching me from the dark. I didn't dare leave the safety of the firelight. I spent the next hour frozen, my mind racing, trying to make sense of the sounds. Maybe it was just a person walking through the woods, maybe another camper, but that didn't make sense. This area wasn't a popular trail. It was secluded for a reason. I didn't sleep that night. My eyes darted around the camp, waiting for any sign of movement. The fire crackled, but the shadows around me seemed darker now, more oppressive. The forest was too quiet, and every gust of wind made me jump. The sound of my heartbeat was deafening in the stillness. By morning, I was exhausted. I hadn't heard anything new in the night, and the sun was beginning to rise. I told myself I was being paranoid. It had to have just been some animal, a deer or a bear, or maybe even a person who had lost their way. I convinced myself it was nothing, but the unease didn't leave. Even as the sun climbed higher, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Something about the forest felt wrong. I packed up camp, trying to keep my movements calm and deliberate. I didn't want to show fear, even if I couldn't fully convince myself it wasn't warranted. I decided to leave the area and head back to my car early. As I walked down the trail, my senses were heightened. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, had me turning my head sharply, expecting someone to be there. But no one ever was. I made it back to my car without incident, but I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief when I finally closed the door and started the engine. The woods had always been my place of peace, but now they felt like a trap, a place that I wasn't welcome. I promised myself I'd never return to that spot again. The drive home was long and silent. The sound of the engine was the only thing that kept me company, and the further I got from the woods, the more the tightness in my chest began to ease. But there was something I couldn't shake, the feeling that, even though I had left the woods behind, something had followed me out. I had always liked the idea of being in the wilderness. No distractions, just the rawness of nature. But nothing could have prepared me for the reality of being alone in the woods, on the edge of a little-known trail, miles from the nearest person. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway to clear my mind, a simple camping trip. I arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon, the sun still hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows between the trees. There was no one else around, just the sounds of rustling leaves and the occasional bird call. The breeze smelled of pine and damp earth. It was peaceful, quiet, a perfect place to disconnect from everything. I set up my tent and made sure everything was secure. The last thing I wanted was for the wind to blow my tent away or for some curious animal to get into my food. The fire pit was already there, surrounded by a ring of stones, so I gathered some dry wood from the forest floor and got the fire going. The crackling of the flames was soothing, and I sat down in front of it, enjoying the warmth. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped. I added more wood to the fire and pulled my jacket tighter around me. The forest seemed to come alive at night, with the sounds of insects, rustling leaves, and distant animal calls filling the air. It was the kind of silence you only get when you're far from civilization. Deep, heavy, and complete. I had planned to cook something over the fire, but I felt too tired after the drive. So, I settled on some packaged food, nothing fancy, just enough to get by. As I ate, I watched the fire dance, my thoughts drifting. There was no rush, no pressure. I didn't have to be anywhere, and that was a rare feeling. The solitude felt good, even if it was a little eerie. The night grew darker, the fire crackling less as the flames started to die down. I poked it a little, adding a few more twigs to keep it going. It was then that I heard something. At first, I thought it was just the wind, maybe a branch creaking under the pressure. But it wasn't. There was a distinct sound, footsteps. Light, almost soft, like someone walking through the leaves. I stopped what I was doing, listening. The sound came again, this time from farther off, maybe 20 feet or so beyond the firelight. I stood up, my heart racing. I wasn't expecting anyone. There wasn't supposed to be anyone else out here. My eyes scanned the edges of the woods, the darkness swallowing everything beyond the fire's reach. I didn't see anything. No movement. No shadows shifting in the trees. I sat back down, trying to brush off the feeling of unease. Maybe it was an animal, deer or a raccoon, something like that. Still, there was something unsettling about the whole situation. The forest felt a little too still now, as if the world had gone quiet to listen. The air was thick with anticipation. The sound came again. This time it was closer, I could hear the crunch of dry leaves underfoot, the unmistakable rhythm of someone, or something, walking toward me. I grabbed the small flashlight I had in my bag, the beam cutting through the dark. Nothing. The woods around me were silent again. My mind raced. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but my gut told me something was wrong. My fingers gripped the flashlight tighter, and I stood, ready to make a break for the car if needed. But before I could even move, the footsteps stopped. I could hear breathing slow, steady, as if someone was standing just out of sight, hidden in the shadows. I didn't know what to do. My breath felt trapped in my chest. I was in the middle of nowhere, miles away from help, with no phone service to call for assistance. I felt the weight of that isolation like never before. I could be gone, and no one would know where to find me. I held my flashlight up, trying to steady my hand. Slowly, I took a step back toward the tent. That was when I heard a twig snap, the sound sharp in the stillness. My heart jumped into my throat. Whoever or whatever was out there was moving again, closer this time, just outside the range of my light. Then there was a rustling, a sudden rush of movement in the bushes behind me. I spun around, the beam of the flashlight catching the edge of the bushes, but again, there was nothing. I stepped forward cautiously, every muscle in my body tense, but as I reached the fire pit, I froze. My foot caught on something. I looked down. It was a piece of rope, frayed at the edges and tied in a loose knot. My stomach dropped. I grabbed it, pulling on it gently. The rope seemed to be attached to something heavy just beneath the ground. I didn't have the courage to dig it up, but I could feel it. A sense that something or someone had been here before me. I had heard of people setting traps, either for animals or for more sinister purposes. I swallowed hard. This was no coincidence. I didn't want to stick around to find out who or what had left the rope, so I quickly started packing up my things. My hands were shaking, but I tried to stay calm, telling myself that I could just leave. It was the best thing to do. I grabbed the tent and the few items I had left, tossing them haphazardly into the backpack. But then, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the leaves. This time, they weren't stopping. They were coming straight for me. I didn't hesitate. I dropped everything, picked up the flashlight, and started running, my heart pounding in my chest. The woods were dark, the trees closing in around me, but I didn't care. I just had to get to the car, to safety. The cold night air burned in my lungs as I pushed myself harder, the beam of my flashlight bouncing erratically on the ground in front of me. The footsteps were getting louder, closer. Whoever or whatever was following me wasn't far behind. I didn't dare look back. My mind was consumed with the image of something dark, hidden in the trees, chasing me, hunting me. I reached the clearing where I had parked my car. I could see the headlights dimly glowing in the distance. I pushed harder, my legs burning, until I was almost there. Just a few more steps, a few more, and then I heard it. A voice. Not a voice I recognized, but a sound, like someone calling my name, just a whisper on the wind. It was enough to freeze me in my tracks. My mind screamed at me to keep moving, but my feet refused to obey. The voice was so clear, so distinct. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly snapped out of it, forcing myself to continue running. I reached my car, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it quickly. My breath came in short, sharp bursts as I fumbled with the keys, desperate to start the engine. Finally, it roared to life. I put the car in drive and sped away, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. I didn't see anything behind me. The woods were still and silent, just as they should have been. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, waiting for me, watching me. I didn't know if it was a person, an animal, or something else, but I was no longer interested in finding out. I had gotten lucky, and that was enough for me. By the time I reached the main road, my heart had slowed. The panic had faded, but I couldn't let go of that feeling. The feeling that maybe I wasn't alone out there after all. Maybe I never had been. I've always loved camping. It's the kind of escape that clears your head, lets you breathe easier, and makes you appreciate the simple things. This was supposed to be one of those trips. Just me, some friends, and the peace of nature. But it didn't turn out that way. It started with us heading out on a Friday afternoon, just after lunch. The sun was still high, the kind of warmth that makes you feel like you're getting away from everything, but it wasn't too hot. Perfect day for a hike into the woods, or so I thought. We parked at the trailhead, a small lot by a local ranger station. I'd been here before, but it had been a while, maybe a year or so. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but looking back, I can see that's where the unease first began to settle in. The ranger station was quiet, almost empty. A few other cars were parked in the lot, but no one was around. Just a wide stretch of trees ahead and the trail that led into the forest. It was peaceful, and that was exactly what we wanted. Just some time away from our busy lives. My friends and I grabbed our gear, backpacks, tents, food, and water. We didn't plan on going too far off the beaten path, just a few miles in to set up camp, then spend the night under the stars. The trail was well marked, a familiar one to most of us, and we followed it without issue. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of the forest, birds, wind, the rustling of leaves, seemed to fade. There was just this stillness around us, like the woods were holding their breath. We found a small clearing just as the sun started dipping behind the trees. Perfect for our tent, and it wasn't too far off the trail, which gave us a sense of safety. It wasn't as remote as I usually liked, but I figured it would do for the night. As we set up camp, there was a feeling in the air that I couldn't shake, a tightness in my chest. Maybe it was just nerves, maybe because I hadn't been camping in a while, but something about this spot just felt off. Still, I kept it to myself. Everyone else was in high spirits, joking around as they unloaded their gear and got the campfire going. We didn't do much at first, just the usual stuff. Cooking over the fire, eating, laughing. But as night fell and the fire crackled, the woods seemed to grow heavier around us. The night air became colder, the shadows deeper. I could hear the distant calls of animals, but no footsteps. Nothing really close. It was unsettling, like we were alone in a vacuum. I tried to shake the feeling off. After all, it was just my mind playing tricks, right? Later on, after we ate and the fire had settled down to embers, we started talking more seriously. It was then I noticed it. There were no other campers around. It was dead quiet. That's when I started to wonder why we hadn't passed anyone else on the trail. There should have been at least a few other groups out here for the weekend. Yet it was just us. I didn't say anything at first, but the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. My friends were too caught up in their own conversation to notice. They were all laughing, but I couldn't help but glance around, looking for anything out of place. The firelight flickered in their eyes, but the shadows behind them seemed to stretch too far. As the hours passed, the night deepened, and I started to feel like we weren't alone. Not in a supernatural sense, no ghosts or strange figures, but the woods themselves felt alive in a way that didn't sit right with me. I didn't know how to explain it, but there was something watching us, something that didn't belong. Eventually, my friends started heading to their tents, and I was left by the fire, poking at the embers with a stick, trying to shake off the creeping anxiety in my chest. That's when I heard it, a rustling, not the normal noise of a squirrel or a deer. This was deliberate, methodical, almost like someone was moving through the underbrush, circling us. I froze, holding my breath. The noise stopped. I told myself it was just a deer, Maybe it was even a raccoon or something harmless. But then I heard it again, closer this time. My heart raced. No one else was awake. I couldn't just wake them for something that might be nothing. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and flicked it on. I scanned the trees, the shadows, the bushes, but I couldn't see anything. Still, the rustling continued, now from the other side of our camp. Slowly, I stood up and crept toward the edge of the clearing. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't ignore the feeling. Something wasn't right. My feet crunched on the dry leaves as I moved cautiously through the dark. The beam of the flashlight swung erratically as I tried to stay calm. The rustling came again, but this time, I could hear it too clearly. It was too close. Without thinking, I turned around and rushed back to the fire. I woke up my friends, told them I thought something was out there. They weren't as worried as I was, but they agreed to stay up for a while longer. We huddled together by the fire, making small talk to distract ourselves from the growing tension. But the woods didn't feel like a comforting place anymore. The firelight seemed to push the darkness back for only a few feet, and beyond that was a thick, suffocating void. The sounds of the forest had gone quiet, save for the occasional snap of a twig. We decided to stay awake for the rest of the night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in on us. It wasn't until we were all gathered around the fire, trying to keep our minds off the growing sense of unease, that we heard something far off, human voices, distant but unmistakable. It didn't sound like another group of campers, though. It was too harsh, too abrupt. At first, we thought it was just someone out on the trail, maybe a few miles away. But then the voices came closer. Not a loud conversation, but the kind of murmured voices you can hear when someone's trying to stay quiet. I froze again, my eyes wide. It was impossible for anyone to have walked that far into the woods without us hearing them before now. Whoever was out there had been following us, staying hidden. I told my friends, and now the fear was real. The voices were getting closer. There was no mistaking it. We weren't alone out here, and the people who were following us weren't just passing through. They were circling, watching us. My pulse shot up as I thought of all the things that could go wrong. Was it some sort of hunting accident? Or worse, was it something more deliberate? The fire crackled, and we all grabbed what we could. Flashlights, knives, anything to defend ourselves. I whispered to my friends to keep quiet, to stay low. We didn't know what they wanted, but we couldn't take any chances. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the voices stopped. No more movement, no more sounds. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed them up. We waited for what felt like an eternity, listening to every rustle in the bushes, every snap of a twig, but it was silent again. The tension didn't leave, but we were too afraid to sleep. The hours dragged on, and at some point, exhaustion took over. We fell asleep sitting up, huddled together by the fire, afraid of what we couldn't see. By dawn, we packed up quickly and left the woods, not speaking much. I never learned who or what was out there, but I know I've never been back to that part of the forest. Sometimes, I can still hear those voices in my head, whispering just beyond the edge of my memory. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend, a break from the noise of city life, a chance to disconnect, breathe in some fresh air, and maybe catch a few fish. I had been planning this camping trip for months. A friend of mine had told me about a secluded spot in the woods, somewhere that wasn't overrun by people, just the sounds of nature and a night under the stars. I drove out alone, leaving my apartment just before sunset to ensure I'd arrive before dark. The sky was already painted in hues of orange and purple as I pulled into a small parking area near the edge of a dense forest. There were a few cars parked in the lot, but nothing that looked like it was coming from a crowd of hikers. I grabbed my gear, tent, sleeping bag, cooking supplies, and started the short hike to my campsite. The woods were quiet. I hadn't seen or heard much of anyone since leaving the parking lot. That wasn't unusual for a remote area, but it was still a little unsettling. The forest was thick with trees, and the trail was narrow, marked with little more than a few faded signs and the occasional arrow carved into a tree. The further I went in, the less I could see of the sky. The trees were closing in on me, their tall, gnarled branches reaching over the path, and it felt like the world outside was slowly fading away. I arrived at the campsite just as the sun disappeared completely. The place was perfect. A small clearing with a few large boulders for seating, a fire ring in the center, and a creek running nearby. I could already smell the fresh scent of pine and damp earth in the air. The fire pit was still cold, though, so I went to work gathering wood. Setting up the tent was easy. I'd done it 100 times before. The sleeping bag was rolled out, my gear organized neatly inside, and the fire was roaring just as the stars began to appear overhead. Everything felt peaceful, quiet, almost too perfect. But as the darkness deepened, something began to feel off. At first, I couldn't place it. The sounds of the forest were still there, the occasional rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, the quiet hum of insects. But it felt like the quiet was louder than it should be, like there was something out there, something watching or waiting just out of sight. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was just being paranoid. It had been a long day of driving and hiking, and I had just gotten to the campsite. So I sat by the fire, trying to relax, watching the flames flicker and dance. But then I heard it, a rustling sound just beyond the tree-line. It was subtle at first, a faint crackling of leaves, then another and another, almost like footsteps but slower, careful. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, listening. The sound stopped. For a long, tense moment, I heard nothing but my own breathing. I kept my eyes fixed on the dark edge of the woods, trying to see if anything was moving. My mind was racing, thinking of animals, deer, maybe, or a bear. But that didn't feel right. This was something different, something human. A chill ran down my spine. I reached for my flashlight, clicking it on and scanning the darkness, but all I saw were trees. I forced myself to take a deep breath, to calm down. It's nothing, I told myself, just an animal or the wind. I wasn't about to let fear get the best of me on my first night out here. But the sound came again, closer this time. It was definitely footsteps, crunching the leaves and branches underfoot. But they were too light, too deliberate, like whoever it was didn't want to be heard. My heart pounded in my chest, and I stood up, moving closer to the fire, the flashlight trembling in my grip. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding weak and uncertain. I didn't want to sound scared, but I was terrified. No response. I stood there for a few more minutes, staring into the woods, my mind running through every possible scenario. Maybe it was just a hiker, lost or looking for the trail. But why hadn't they called out? Why was everything so quiet? Then, out of nowhere, I heard it. A low, gravelly voice, distant but clear, whispering through the trees. "You're not alone." I froze. The voice wasn't like the usual sounds of the woods. It wasn't a bird call or the wind rustling through branches. It was human, and it was close. My heart started to race, and a wave of dread washed over me. I had no idea where it was coming from, or who was out there. Maybe I was just hearing things. Maybe it was just the wind after all. But then I heard the sound of movement again, closer this time, much closer. I swung the flashlight in that direction, my hands trembling. Nothing. I could feel my throat tightening, the fear gripping me more tightly now. I had to be imagining it, right? But that voice, it hadn't been a figment of my imagination. I didn't want to stick around to find out. I grabbed my things and hastily packed up the tent, my hands shaking as I tried to fold everything into my bag. The fire had burned down to embers, but I didn't care. I just wanted to leave. Then, as I was about to head back to the trail, I saw something moving in the shadows. It wasn't a person. It was too fast, too fluid. It was a shape darting between the trees, just out of the reach of my flashlight. For a split second, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a deer, but there was something unnatural about it. Something wrong. The way it moved, the way it ducked behind trees without making a sound. It wasn't like anything I had ever seen before. That's when I decided I had to leave. There was no time to waste. I wasn't about to stick around and find out what that thing was. I turned and ran, not bothering to keep the flashlight aimed at the ground anymore. The beam bounced erratically, cutting through the dark, but I didn't care. All I could think about was getting out of the woods. My foot caught on a root, and I fell hard, scraping my hands against the rough ground. Pain shot through me, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet, pushing myself forward, not caring about the bleeding cuts on my arms. Every step felt like an eternity. The darkness seemed to press in on me, suffocating, and I could hear something behind me, rustling, shuffling, like footsteps again. It was getting closer. I forced myself to move faster, my lungs burning, my body screaming for a break. I didn't stop until I finally saw the parking area in the distance, the dim light of the cars shining through the trees. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I reached the car, my hands still shaking as I fumbled for the keys. I didn't waste time locking the doors. I just started the engine and drove. I didn't stop until I was back on the main road, miles away from the woods. By then, my heart had slowed to a normal pace, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. The fear still lingered in the back of my mind. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something in the distance, something watching. When I got home, I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I didn't want to sound crazy, but every time I thought about that voice and the shape moving through the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there, and I wasn't sure if I ever truly would be again. I had always loved camping, the way it allowed me to disconnect, to be in nature. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape from the chaos of everyday life, a chance to reset. I had been camping alone before, so I wasn't worried. There was something about the silence in the woods that made me feel like I could breathe again. I wasn't out there for any particular reason, just to spend the weekend alone, away from people. The only company I expected was the occasional bird chirping or the distant rustle of leaves. The campsite I had chosen wasn't marked on any maps, a bit off the beaten path, but it was exactly what I was looking for. Secluded, peaceful. When I got there, the area looked perfect. Tall pines surrounded a small clearing where I pitched my tent. The ground was soft, the air crisp. The firewood I had brought with me was more than enough to last for the weekend. By the time I finished setting up, the sun was already starting to dip behind the trees. I sat down near the fire, enjoying the warmth as the day gave way to night. As night settled, the woods seemed to come alive, not with supernatural sounds, but with the natural noises of the wilderness. The occasional rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the wind moving through the branches. I was used to this, but something felt off. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. It was a subtle unease, like the feeling you get when you're sure someone's watching you. But when you look around, you see nothing. I shrugged it off. I was alone in the woods. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me. I got in my tent when the fire died down, the darkness outside swallowing the campsite whole. Inside the tent, it was warm and I felt safe. The sounds of the forest outside were muffled now, the stillness surrounding me. But that feeling of unease lingered, nagging at me. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just a natural reaction to being alone in the wilderness. The first night passed without incident. and the next morning I woke to the bright sun filtering through the trees. I felt better, more grounded. After breakfast, I decided to go for a short hike around the area, just to explore a little. I knew the woods well enough to navigate them, but something was different now. There was an odd quietness to the forest that hadn't been there the day before. The birds weren't singing, and there was no wind moving through the trees. It felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. I shrugged it off again, thinking it was just a fluke, but as I walked further into the woods, I began to feel that strange sense of being watched again. It wasn't just my imagination this time. I could feel it deep in my chest, the sensation of eyes on me. I stopped walking for a moment, trying to shake off the feeling, but it wouldn't go away. The air seemed heavier now, almost as if something was pressing down on the entire forest. That's when I noticed it. Up ahead, partially obscured by the trees, there was a clearing I hadn't seen before. The ground was disturbed, like someone had recently been there, maybe setting something up. But there was no sign of a campsite, no fire pit, no tent. Just broken branches and trampled undergrowth. And what caught my eye the most, what made my stomach drop, was a large, fresh set of footprints. They weren't human, but they were too large to be from any kind of animal I knew. They looked almost unnatural, too wide, too deep. I stood there for a long moment, trying to make sense of it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my gut told me to turn around, to leave. But I didn't. Curiosity got the best of me. I cautiously stepped forward into the clearing, my eyes scanning the area. It felt like the ground itself was holding its breath. And then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible rustling in the trees behind me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I turned slowly, hoping it was just the wind, but I saw nothing. I stood there for a long time, trying to convince myself it was just an animal, a deer or something small. But the rustling was too deliberate, too close. It was something else. With my heart racing, I quickly retraced my steps back to the campsite, the feeling of being followed never leaving me. Every time I turned a corner or glanced behind me, I expected to see something, someone, in the shadows. But nothing was there. The woods were as silent as before, but that silence felt oppressive now, as though it was filled with an unspoken presence. I made it back to the campsite, but even the act of setting up camp again didn't ease the tension that had built up in my chest. The fire felt smaller now, like it couldn't quite warm the cold that had settled inside me. I was trying to reason with myself, to tell myself it was just a freak occurrence, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I wasn't alone. That night, I barely slept. Every crack of a branch, every whisper of wind made me jump. I kept telling myself to calm down, but the unease wouldn't let up. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside the tent, slow, deliberate steps. My breath caught in my throat. I stayed perfectly still, my heart racing, straining my ears to hear anything else. But there was nothing. The next morning, I decided to pack up and leave. I couldn't explain it, but something told me it wasn't safe to stay another night. The unease had grown into full-blown fear. The woods were no longer peaceful. They felt like a trap. As I packed up my things, I kept looking over my shoulder, as though expecting someone, or something, to be watching me. I made it back to the car without incident, but even as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. My eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone or something in the woods behind me. But there was nothing, just the empty road and the trees. I got home later that day, feeling exhausted, my body physically drained from the tension. But at least I was safe. The woods, the strange footprints, the feeling of being watched, they were all behind me, or so I thought. It wasn't until a week later that I found out just how close I had come to something much darker than I had imagined. I had left a few items in the trunk of my car, camping gear I hadn't unpacked, As I was pulling out my backpack, I found something strange. A small piece of cloth, torn and stained with something dark. I didn't recognize it, but the pattern looked familiar, like something I'd seen in the woods. It was part of a jacket, one that didn't belong to me. And then I remembered the prints, the strange, unnatural ones in the clearing. I don't know who or what was following me that day, but I'm sure of one thing. I wasn't alone in those woods, and I never will be again. I've always loved the outdoors. There's something calming about being away from everything, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence. That's why when I got the opportunity to go on a solo camping trip deep in the forest, I didn't hesitate for a second. It was supposed to be a break, a chance to clear my head, to disconnect from the noise of everyday life. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. I arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon, the sun already starting to dip low behind the trees. The air was cool, and the forest smelled like earth and pine. It was perfect, quiet, and untouched. I set up my tent by a small creek and gathered some wood for a fire. As the sky darkened, I started the fire, its crackling sound the only noise besides the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. I sat there, warming my hands, watching the flames dance in the dark. The forest around me was quiet, too quiet, if I'm being honest. The usual sounds of insects and birds were absent. Maybe it was the time of year or the weather, but the stillness started to feel wrong. My mind played tricks on me, making me think I heard faint footsteps nearby. I'd shake it off, tell myself it was nothing, just the wind, or maybe a deer or raccoon moving around. But as the night wore on, the unease settled deeper. The crackling fire was the only thing that kept the darkness at bay. I made sure my tent was tightly closed, and I huddled near the warmth of the fire. The trees around me loomed like dark giants in the night. I knew I was far from any other campsite, at least a few miles into the woods. No one was supposed to be out here. The shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should have, twisting with every gust of wind. A chill ran down my spine, and I didn't know why. I kept telling myself it was just the cold getting to me. The fire flickered, and I leaned in to feed it a few more logs. That's when I heard it. A soft snap, like a twig breaking. It was coming from behind me, near the edge of the trees. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat. The snap was too clear, too deliberate to be an animal. And it was too close. I turned slowly, eyes scanning the dark tree line. Nothing, just the trees, swaying gently in the wind. My heart thumped in my chest, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. Maybe it was an animal, maybe a bear or something. There were bears in these woods, but I hadn't expected to encounter one this far out. I grabbed a large stick and poked the fire, watching the flames flare up, hoping the bright light would keep anything at bay. Then I heard it again. Another snap, followed by a low rustle. It was much closer now, maybe only a few feet from the fire. My instincts told me to get inside the tent, lock it up tight. But something held me there, frozen, eyes wide, scanning the darkness. I couldn't make out any shapes, couldn't see anything in the shadows, but I could feel it. Someone or something was out there. I stood up slowly, making my way over to my backpack. I grabbed my flashlight, but I hesitated. Should I really shine it out there? What if it was just a deer? What if it was something more? Before I could make up my mind, the rustling got louder. It wasn't random. It was purposeful, slow, like whatever was out there was creeping toward me. My heartbeat picked up, the sound of it pounding in my ears. I could taste the fear in the air, thick and suffocating. And then I heard a voice, not words, just a low hum, barely audible. It sent a shiver down my spine. That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight, flicked it on, and aimed it at the trees. My hands were shaking as I scanned the dark forest. The beam of light cut through the darkness, sweeping left to right. Nothing. There was nothing there, but the rustling, the humming. It was still there, faint but unmistakable. I didn't wait any longer. I bolted for the tent, stumbling over the uneven ground. My flashlight slipped from my hands and clattered to the ground, its light flickering out. I didn't even look back. I scrambled inside the tent, zipping it up quickly, my breath ragged and shallow. The sound of my own heartbeat pounded in my head. I lay there, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening. There was no rustling now, no humming, just the wind. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I was just overtired, overthinking things. I tried to convince myself of that. I told myself to sleep, to relax, but sleep wouldn't come. The anxiety gnawed at me, keeping me wide awake. The hours dragged on in silence, the only sound the occasional gust of wind against the fabric of the tent. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out here. Eventually, the first rays of morning light began to break through the trees. The sun was rising, and with it came a sense of relief. The night had been long, but the dawn brought with it a sense of safety. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, taking in the cool, fresh air. The forest was still, the birds beginning to stir. That's when I noticed something. At the edge of the campsite, where the trees met the clearing, there were footprints. Large, human-sized prints in the soft earth, heading in the direction of the creek. They were fresh, too, still moist, like whoever had left them had only just walked by. Couldn't believe it. I must have imagined everything last night. But those prints were real, and they were far too big to belong to any animal I knew. I didn't wait any longer. I packed up my camp in a rush, every sense on high alert. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever, whatever, had been watching me was still nearby. I hurried back to the trailhead, not stopping, not looking back until I reached my car. When I finally drove away, the sense of danger didn't leave me. The feeling of being hunted lingered, following me like a shadow. And to this day, I still don't know what it was out there. Maybe it was another camper, maybe someone lost. But something about it didn't feel right. The quiet, the way the forest seemed to close in around me, the feeling that I was being watched. Those footprints are still burned in my mind. I never went back into those woods, and I'm not sure I ever will. It was supposed to be just another camping trip, something to get away from the noise of the world. A couple of days with my best friend, Jake. Nothing serious, just some hiking, fishing, and a campfire. We'd both been needing a break. So we packed up the truck, drove through winding mountain roads, and set up camp deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. The sun had just dipped behind the trees, painting the sky with a deep orange hue as we worked to get the fire going. It was the perfect evening. The air was cool but not cold, the forest around us quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves. We set up the tent, gathered some wood, and cracked open a couple of beers as the flames danced in front of us. Jake and I had been friends for years, always sharing an appreciation for the outdoors. We'd gone camping countless times before, so everything felt familiar. But for some reason, tonight felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it. The silence of the woods seemed louder than usual. The way the wind moved through the trees, almost like it was whispering something to me. The night dragged on, and soon the stars took over the sky. We talked for hours, reminiscing about old memories and making plans for the future. We didn't have a care in the world. By the time we crawled into our sleeping bags, it was well past midnight, and the fire had long since burned out. I fell asleep pretty quickly, though there was an unease that had started to settle in my chest. I had heard something earlier, just a faint crack of a twig snapping in the distance. It was probably just an animal, I told myself. maybe a deer or something larger moving through the woods. But even with that reasoning, something in the pit of my stomach told me it wasn't that simple. I woke up to a noise that sent a chill down my spine. At first, I couldn't place it. It was too quiet, too subtle to pinpoint. But then I heard it again, a faint rustling outside the tent, like something was moving through the brush, very slowly, too slowly. I held my breath and listened, trying to make sense of the sound. It wasn't an animal, at least not any animal I'd ever heard before. I sat up in the dark, straining to hear, my heart pounding now. Jake was still asleep, his shallow breathing coming in slow, rhythmic waves. The sounds continued, growing slightly louder, as if whatever it was circling the camp. I reached over to shake Jake, but something held me back. I couldn't explain it. My body felt frozen, almost paralyzed by some unseen force. The noise stopped for a moment, and for a second, I thought maybe it had just been my imagination. But then I heard it again, a soft scrape against the tent fabric, followed by a slow, deliberate tapping sound. It wasn't the kind of noise you'd expect from a deer or a raccoon. It was too methodical. I couldn't stay in the tent any longer. My legs felt shaky as I quietly unzipped the door, careful not to wake Jake. I stepped outside, my breath fogging up in the cold night air, and stood perfectly still, listening. The forest was eerily silent now. The only sound was the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. But there was something about the stillness that didn't sit right with me. It was too quiet. The usual nighttime hum of insects and critters had completely disappeared. I looked around the camp, scanning the dark outline of the trees. It was hard to see anything beyond the reach of the dim light from the dying embers of our fire. Nothing. I waited a few minutes, but the feeling that something was wrong didn't go away. I turned back to the tent, deciding I'd had enough. Just as I started to step back inside, I heard the noise again. This time it was closer, much closer. I froze. My heart skipped a beat as I looked around frantically. The noise wasn't coming from the woods. It was coming from the edge of the camp, right where the shadows were thickest beyond the light. I couldn't make out what it was, but I could feel it. I don't know how to describe it, but it felt like eyes were watching me. I stayed perfectly still, trying to keep my breathing quiet. The last thing I wanted was for whatever it was to know I was there. Then, as if my own thoughts had triggered it, I heard a soft, barely audible sound. A slow, deliberate step. Footsteps. They were too heavy to be an animal, and they didn't sound like someone lost or wandering. They were purposeful, measured. Whoever or whatever was out there, they knew exactly what they were doing. My stomach twisted. I wanted to call out to Jake, but I couldn't. If this was some kind of prank, I didn't want to scare him. But if it wasn't, well, I wasn't sure what I was dealing with. The steps came closer. I backed up slowly, retreating to the tent, my mind racing. As I crawled back inside, I finally shook Jake awake. "Jake!" I whispered urgently. "Jake, wake up." He stirred but didn't fully open his eyes at first. "What's up?" "She'll listen," I urged. First, there was nothing. No footsteps, no movement. The air was still. But then, just when I thought I might be imagining things, I heard it again. That soft scrape, just on the edge of my hearing. Jake's eyes opened wide, and I could see the concern written all over his face. "Did you hear that?" I asked, barely able to keep my voice steady. Jake didn't respond at first. He listened intently, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, I heard it." The sound was getting closer again. I was about to suggest we pack up and leave when I saw something that made my blood run cold. A shadow moving quickly past the tent, barely visible against the trees. I couldn't tell what it was, but it was too large to be an animal. "We need to go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Jake looked at me, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. But then he heard the footsteps too, moving in a way that seemed almost too controlled, too deliberate. Without another word, he grabbed his flashlight, and we both hurried to pack up our gear. Our hands were shaking, fumbling with zippers and straps, but we didn't stop moving. The shadow outside moved again, faster now, like it was aware of our every move. We didn't know who or what it was, but we knew we weren't alone. We had just finished packing the last of the gear when the footsteps stopped. For a long, terrible moment, there was no sound at all. Then, without warning, there was a loud crash. Something had hit the ground with tremendous force, breaking branches as it came down. Jake and I both jumped, looking around in a panic. The air was thick with tension, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. We didn't hesitate. We bolted. We grabbed our bags and ran toward the truck, not stopping until we were inside, doors locked, engine roaring to life. Neither of us spoke as we sped out of the forest, our hearts pounding in our chests. I don't know what we encountered that night, but I'm sure of one thing: it wasn't human. It's been weeks since we left, and the memory of it still haunts me. But I'm also thankful we got out of there when we did. I'll never go camping in that part of the woods again. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, a weekend getaway in the woods to disconnect from the constant noise of city life. I had planned it all. A secluded spot near a small, quiet stream, surrounded by trees thick enough to block out the world, and just far enough from the usual hiking trails to ensure that we wouldn't be bothered by anyone. I'd done this kind of thing 100 times before, but something about this trip felt different. Maybe it was the weather. Rain clouds had been hanging low in the sky since the morning, or maybe it was the fact that I was going solo for the first time in years. Either way, the thought nagged at me as I set up my tent, one of those lightweight ones that would be easy to carry but still kept me protected from the elements. The woods were quiet, and I mean really quiet. Not the kind of silence where you can hear birds chirping or the wind rustling through the leaves. No, this was the kind of silence where every step I took felt like it was echoing in an empty void. At first, I chalked it up to being in a remote part of the forest, but as I settled in and started making my dinner, it didn't sit right with me. I built a small fire near the edge of the campsite, using dry wood I had gathered earlier. The fire crackled to life, the sound a small comfort against the odd silence of the forest. I roasted some sausages and set up my camp chair, thinking about how peaceful it all was. The wind picked up, rattling the branches of the trees above me, and I felt a brief sense of unease. It wasn't the kind of unease that comes from fear, but rather the feeling that something was off in a way I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was the way the trees seemed to close in around me, their dark trunks like silent sentinels. Maybe it was the shadows that seemed to stretch a little longer than they should have. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the feeling that I wasn't alone. The first odd thing happened just as the fire started to die down. I had just finished my meal and was leaning back in my chair, letting the warmth of the fire chase away the chill of the evening air. The sun had set fully now, and the sky was a deep shade of purple, stars scattered across it like tiny shards of glass. Everything was still, and the only sound was the occasional crack of a twig breaking under the weight of an animal's feet. Then, from somewhere deep in the woods, came the sound of a twig snapping, sharp and clear, cutting through the silence. I froze. It wasn't a distant sound. It was close, too close. I leaned forward in my chair, straining my ears. For a few seconds, there was nothing, just the soft whisper of the wind and the crackling of the fire. Then, another snap, louder this time, and then a third. It was definitely not an animal. There was a distinct rhythm to it, like someone was deliberately stepping on twigs, taking their time, moving slowly through the woods. I grabbed my flashlight from my bag and clicked it on, aiming it toward the source of the noise. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing, just trees, and the distant sound of the stream. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe a deer or a raccoon was moving around. Animals did that all the time, right? I wasn't some inexperienced camper. I'd been out in the woods alone before, and I'd heard strange things in the night. The wind, animals, the occasional branch snapping. Nothing unusual. I wasn't going to let my imagination run wild. But still, the sounds kept coming. Soft, deliberate footfalls, always in the same rhythm, moving closer. I stood up slowly, trying to keep my breathing steady. I was starting to feel that uneasy knot in my stomach, the kind of feeling you get when you know something isn't right but can't figure out exactly what it is. I scanned the woods again with my flashlight, but all I saw were trees and shadows. Then I heard it, a low rustle from the bushes, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy shifting through the undergrowth. I spun toward the noise, shining the light directly into the bushes. Nothing. The silence returned, as thick and suffocating as it had been before. I don't know why I didn't pack up and leave then. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe I didn't want to admit that something was off. So I stayed. I tossed more wood onto the fire, trying to keep the flames high and bright, and forced myself to focus on my book. But every now and then, I couldn't help but glance up, my eyes scanning the tree line, looking for anything that might be out there. There was nothing, just shadows and the flickering light of my fire. The night grew colder as the hours passed. I tried to ignore the feeling of eyes watching me, the gnawing sense that someone or something was out there. I convinced myself that it was just the forest, the way it played tricks on your mind when you were alone for too long. So I went to bed early, crawling into my tent, zipped it up, and tried to sleep. That's when the second strange thing happened. I had been lying there for what felt like hours, eyes wide open in the dark, listening to the wind whip through the trees. I had just started to drift off when I heard it. A faint tapping sound, rhythmic and insistent, coming from the side of my tent. My eyes snapped open. I lay there, frozen, trying to make sense of it. The tapping was soft but distinct, like a finger gently tapping against the canvas.
Top, 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 top.
It wasn't the wind. It wasn't rain. It was deliberate. Someone or something was on the other side of my tent. I held my breath, straining to listen. The tapping stopped. And then, a moment later, it started again. This time lower, like it was closer.
Top, top, top.
A soft, steady sound sent a chill through me. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. I wanted to get out of the tent, grab my flashlight, and see who or what was on the other side. But I was frozen. Fear gripped me like a vice, and I couldn't move. I stayed there, listening, waiting for the tapping to stop, or for some other noise to break the silence. But nothing came, just the sound of the tapping, slow and measured, against the side of the tent. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the tapping ceased. I lay there in the dark, heart pounding in my chest, my thoughts a jumbled mess. It wasn't until I could no longer hear the noise that I allowed myself to breathe again. The rest of the night passed in a blur of restless tossing and turning, but nothing else happened. No more tapping, no more sounds in the woods. The next morning, I woke up with a pounding headache and a nagging feeling in my gut. The sky was overcast, and the air felt heavy with moisture. It had rained lightly overnight, leaving the ground damp and the smell of wet earth in the air. I didn't want to be out there anymore. I packed up my campsite quickly, stuffing my tent and gear into my backpack with a sense of urgency. I didn't take my time, didn't care about leaving the site clean. All I wanted was to get out of those woods. As I hiked back to the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the distance, just beyond the trees. But there was no one. The woods were as empty as they had been the day before. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I slammed the trunk shut, jumped into the driver's seat, and drove off without a second thought. The tension in my shoulders started to ease as I got farther away from the woods, but the unease lingered, gnawing at me from the back of my mind. What had happened out there? Who or what had been watching me? I still don't know, but I can tell you this. I'll never camp alone in those woods again, and I don't think I'll ever go back to the forest, not after that night. Some places, some experiences just stay with you. And the more I think about it, the more I realize that it wasn't just the tapping. It wasn't just the footsteps or the strange silence. It was the feeling of being watched, of not being alone in a place that should have been peaceful and safe. That feeling never truly leaves you, and that's the scariest part of it all. I didn't plan on being out here this long. One weekend trip to the woods, 2 days, 3 if we're lucky, was supposed to be an escape from the noise of daily life. Just a way to disconnect, you know? The kind of trip where you throw a tent and a few cans of food in a bag, head out into the wild, and let everything go for a little while. The trail I picked wasn't too far out, about 2 miles in, and it was known to be a pretty straightforward hike. No crazy terrain, no rough cliffs, just trees and open spaces. The kind of hike that, even if you're not in perfect shape, doesn't make you feel like you're about to collapse halfway through. But as soon as we reached the spot where we'd camp, things felt off. I remember thinking it was just the isolation at first, the strange being alone in the woods, no matter how many people you're with. You look around and everything seems peaceful, but at the same time, there's a feeling in the air, like nature is watching you, waiting for you to slip up. That's how it was when I set up camp. I pushed the thought aside. It was just me, a few friends, and a fire pit, right? No reason to feel like I was being observed. By sunset, I started gathering wood for the fire. There were still a few clouds in the sky, but no sign of rain. The trees were tall, oak and pine, their thick trunks twisting upward, blocking out most of the light. The space around our camp was pretty clear, but when I stepped further into the woods for the wood, the path was dark and seemed to stretch further than I expected, almost like the woods were reaching out. I told myself it was fine. Just get back to camp, I muttered under my breath, thinking how easy it'd be to freak myself out. The fire was lit quickly, crackling and snapping as we started setting up our sleeping bags and chairs around it. I took the first watch, not because I was the most experienced, but because I didn't feel like going to sleep yet. My mind kept wandering, and not in a good way. The woods at night are different. You don't notice the way the trees stretch their limbs across the sky during the day. At night, they look like dark shapes moving with the wind. And when you're sitting in front of a fire, everything around you feels far too quiet. The crackle of the flames, the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze, but that's it. Everything else is still. I swear, I kept hearing something moving around the perimeter of our camp, but it was hard to tell if it was an animal or my own nerves getting the best of me. I had the feeling someone or something was out there, but the fire's light couldn't reach far enough to give me any kind of reassurance. It wasn't until I heard the first twig snap, close by but not too close, that I knew something was wrong. It was too loud, too deliberate. I froze, staring into the blackness just beyond the campfire's reach. My pulse spiked as I heard it again, this time closer. Another crack, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I shook it off, of course. I convinced myself it was just a deer or a raccoon. Maybe. It didn't help that I was alone by the fire. I needed someone to share the anxiety with, but no one seemed to notice. Everyone else was laughing, talking, and taking it easy, while I just sat there, eyes darting around, listening. The sound of branches snapping continued throughout the night, and it didn't stop when I went to bed. It didn't even stop after I fell asleep, despite the fact that I told myself it was all in my head. The thing is, once you hear that snap, once you hear something move in the dark, you don't unhear it. The next morning, I woke up early, well before the sun broke over the horizon, because the cold had gotten to me. I was trying to shake off the feeling from the night before, but as soon as I stood up and stepped outside the tent, I realized something was wrong. The woods looked different in the morning light. Everything was still, like it had been frozen overnight. But it wasn't just the stillness that felt off. It was the lack of tracks. Not a single footprint anywhere around the camp, despite the fact that we'd all walked in and out several times the day before. The grass around the tents was undisturbed, like no one had been there at all. I called out to the others, and they all came out groggily, barely awake. They didn't notice what I was seeing, and I didn't know how to explain it. It was just too perfect, too clean, like the woods were waiting for something. I couldn't shake the feeling, but we went about our day as planned. We hiked a little further into the woods. All the while, I couldn't ignore the odd sense that we weren't alone. At first, I told myself it was just my nerves, but as we moved deeper into the woods, the silence returned. It wasn't the peaceful silence you expect when you're alone with nature. No birds, no insects, no rustling leaves, not even the wind, just dead quiet. It felt like the air had thickened around us. The only sound was the crunch of our boots on the forest floor. We talked less and less as the hours went by. The further we went, the stranger it felt. We came across a narrow stream that wasn't marked on any of the maps I'd studied before the trip. Something about it felt wrong. The water didn't sparkle or shine the way you'd expect. It was dark, almost murky, like something had been living in it for a long time. My friend Mark bent down to touch the water, and I swear I saw his expression change for a moment, like he had touched something cold, too cold. "We should head back," I said. The others agreed, and we made our way back toward camp. But as we retraced our steps, things started getting stranger. The trees that I'd passed by earlier, the ones I thought I knew, seemed to have shifted slightly. It wasn't until I recognized a particular knot in one of the trunks, one I was sure had been on the right side of the path, that I realized we weren't on the trail anymore. We'd been walking in circles. At first, I thought maybe I was just confused, but when we tried to find the way back to our campsite, it was like the trail kept slipping away from us. The woods had changed in a way I couldn't explain. Every direction seemed the same, dark, thick with trees, and stretching endlessly. The air felt thick again, oppressive. We shouted for help, but our voices were swallowed by the silence. We tried using our phones, but there was no signal. No surprise there. It was deep in the woods, but I hadn't expected the whole area to be so dead. We walked for what felt like hours trying to find the way back, and the whole time, it felt like the forest was pushing us further, like we were walking deeper and deeper into something we didn't understand. That's when I saw it. A figure not far away, standing perfectly still, just beyond the trees. A silhouette. I barely registered it at first, but then it moved, and I froze. It wasn't one of us. It was someone or something else. I knew it the moment I saw it. The figure didn't move like a person. It was almost gliding. I'm not sure how to explain it, but it didn't belong. The others hadn't seen it, and I didn't say anything, but my heart was pounding. I turned around and started walking faster, urging the others to hurry up. We pushed through the trees, the underbrush catching at our clothes, and then, when we turned a corner, we saw it. The clearing, the camp. It was still there. We rushed back to the tents, packed up quickly, and left. None of us said a word. No one even questioned it when I suggested we leave immediately. It didn't matter what had happened or what we saw. It was enough for us to know that whatever was in those woods, it wasn't meant for us. And I don't think any of us ever fully understood what happened out there. But we never went back. The sun was dipping lower behind the trees as I set up my tent in a small clearing. It wasn't exactly a campsite, but it was remote enough that I figured I could get away with spending the night without anyone bothering me. I'd been hiking for hours through the woods, alone. I always preferred the solitude of the forest, where everything felt quieter, away from the hum of city life. But as I hammered the final stake into the ground, a shiver crept up my spine. It wasn't from the cold. It was that feeling like someone was watching. I shook it off and focused on the task at hand. I was here to relax, to clear my head, not to let my imagination run wild. The woods were vast, and my phone had no signal out here anyway, so there was no point in worrying about anything. It was just me and the wilderness. I unrolled my sleeping bag and set up the rest of my camp, trying to ignore the unease that seemed to grow with each passing minute. The woods were quiet, but not in the peaceful way I had imagined. There were no birds singing, no insects buzzing, just the occasional rustle of leaves, which could have been wind, or it could have been something else. Couldn't tell. By the time I had everything set up, the light was almost gone. I sat by the campfire I had managed to start with some dry wood I found nearby, listening to the crackling flames. There was something comforting about the fire, but still that feeling, the sense that I wasn't truly alone, lingered. I tried to distract myself, reading a book by the flickering light of the fire, but my mind kept drifting. Every few minutes, I'd look up into the darkness of the trees, half expecting to see something moving just beyond the reach of the firelight. But nothing ever did. Just the wind shaking the branches and the occasional snap of a twig. I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, that I was just being paranoid. It's not like there were any other people out here, or were there? I had only seen a handful of other hikers that morning, and they were long gone. So why did it feel like someone was out there, just waiting for the right moment? Around midnight, I gave up on trying to read. My eyes were heavy, and the fire was dying down. I grabbed my flashlight, turned it off, and crawled into my tent, trying to block out the noises from the woods. The wind was picking up now, rustling the branches, but there was still no sign of animals. Nothing that would explain why the silence felt so unnatural. I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep, but it wasn't working. Every little sound, the scrape of a rock, the snap of a branch, the distant sound of something moving, seemed amplified in the darkness. I rolled over in my sleeping bag, unable to find a comfortable position. Then I heard it. First, it was so faint that I thought I might have imagined it. A soft, rhythmic thudding sound, like footsteps, but not the kind of footsteps you'd expect from an animal. It was too deliberate, too human. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound was closer now, coming from somewhere just outside my tent. My heart started to race. I didn't want to move, didn't want to draw attention to myself, but my body was already telling me to get up, to do something. The thudding stopped. For a moment, everything was silent again. I almost convinced myself that it was nothing, just the wind or some trick of my imagination. But then I heard something else, voices. Low, murmuring voices that seemed to come from all around me, but no words I could make out. They were too muffled, too distant. I lay still, too afraid to move. The only thing I could hear was my heartbeat pounding in my chest. My flashlight was in my bag, just a few feet away, but I didn't dare reach for it. I didn't want to risk making a sound that would give me away. The murmuring voices faded, and the thudding started again. Closer this time. Someone or something was definitely out there. I knew it wasn't an animal. It sounded like a person, maybe more than one. But why? Why would anyone be out here, in the middle of nowhere, at this time of night? My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was just other hikers, lost or looking for a place to camp. Maybe I wasn't the only one who thought this part of the woods was secluded. But something about the way they moved, the way they made no attempt to make themselves known, felt wrong. I waited, my eyes wide open in the dark. The fire had long since burned out, and now the only light came from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the trees. I listened for any sound, any indication that whatever was out there was leaving. But nothing came. Then I heard it, a sound like a branch snapping. It was close, too close. My breath caught in my throat. There was someone right outside my tent. I could hear their movements, slow and deliberate. I felt my stomach churn. What should I do? Should I confront them? Stay quiet? I had no idea what was out there, and the last thing I wanted was to find out in the worst possible way. The footsteps stopped. It was too quiet now. I couldn't hear anything, not even the rustling of leaves, just the occasional creak of the trees swaying in the wind. I had to move. I couldn't just lie here and wait for something to happen. But what if making a noise would make things worse? Then, as if to answer my question, the sound of footsteps came again. They were moving away from the tent now, back toward the edge of the clearing. But I wasn't convinced that I was safe. Whoever, whatever was out there hadn't left. They were just circling around, waiting for something. I waited another few minutes, making sure I wasn't hearing things, before I grabbed my flashlight from the bag. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the button. The beam of light cut through the darkness like a knife, sweeping across the trees. For a split second, I thought I saw something move, just a shadow, nothing concrete, but I couldn't be sure. I had to leave. I couldn't stay here another second. The uncertainty was killing me. I unzipped my tent, slowly and as quietly as I could, trying not to make any sound that would alert whoever was out there. I slid out, crouching low to the ground, and grabbed my backpack and flashlight. My heart was racing, my head spinning with fear. I started to move, my feet crunching on the dry leaves. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to get away from the clearing, away from whatever was lurking in the darkness. I didn't stop running until I reached the trail, gasping for breath. The weight of my backpack felt like it was crushing me, but I didn't care. I had to get back to safety. By the time I reached the trailhead, I was exhausted and terrified. The woods had never seemed so oppressive, so full of hidden dangers. But I was out. I was safe. I didn't know what had been out there, but I didn't want to find out. Not ever again. The next morning, I returned to the spot where I had set up camp, just to see if there was any sign of what had happened. But there was nothing.
No footprints.
No evidence of anyone else being there. And yet, something about the experience stayed with me. A lingering feeling that I had been watched, followed. I would never forget the silence of the woods that night, the quiet menace that had crept up on me from the darkness. I never really understood why some people loved camping. Sure, the idea of escaping the noise of the city, getting into nature, and having some quiet time sounded good in theory. But when I actually found myself alone in the middle of the woods, I began to question whether it was the best idea after all. It started out normal enough. I had packed my gear, tent, sleeping bag, flashlight, and food. The kind of camping trip I thought would be simple, no different from any other outdoor adventure. A weekend getaway to disconnect. That's what I told myself. Just me, the trees, and some fresh air. I drove out to a little-known forest area, a spot I had read about online where few people went. They said it was peaceful, secluded, and the perfect place for someone looking to escape crowds. There were no fancy campgrounds, no well-maintained paths or tourist attractions. It was just woods, wild and untouched. The sun had already begun to dip when I arrived. The sky was that soft orange color, the kind that made everything feel calm and distant. I parked my car near a small clearing and decided to set up camp just before it got completely dark. As I worked, setting up the tent and laying out my stuff, I noticed how quiet everything was. No cars, no animals, no wind. Just this unnatural silence. the kind of silence that made my skin crawl a little. The only sound was the occasional snap of a twig underfoot as I moved around. Even the birds had gone quiet. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I was just being paranoid. After all, it was just a quiet forest, nothing to worry about. I finished setting up the tent and went to start a fire, hoping the crackling flames would add a bit of noise to break the eerie silence. I found some dry wood nearby and got a small fire going. The flames were weak at first, but they grew with time, crackling and spitting. By the time the fire was fully going, it was dark, the kind of dark that swallows everything. The kind of dark where even the trees around me became shadows, like they were closing in on me. I sat by the fire, roasting marshmallows, and tried to enjoy the moment. I was alone, yes, but it wasn't supposed to be a scary experience. It was just camping. I had packed a book to read, and I settled in with it for a while, listening to the small popping sounds from the fire and the occasional rustle in the bushes. It was probably an animal, I thought, just a squirrel or a rabbit moving through the brush. Still, the noise was enough to make me glance over my shoulder once in a while. Time passed slowly, and I found myself growing tired. It had been a long drive, and the peace of the woods, while initially unsettling, was starting to lull me into a kind of stupor. I decided to head to bed and get some sleep. The tent felt small and warm compared to the cold air outside. But sleep didn't come as easily as I thought it would. As I lay there, staring up at the thin walls of the tent, something felt off. It wasn't just the silence anymore. It was the feeling that I wasn't alone, that there was something else out there, watching. I told myself it was nothing, just the typical overactive imagination, the kind that creeps up on you when you're in a new place in the middle of nowhere. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I lay still, eyes wide open, listening. There it was again, a rustle. Not the usual nighttime forest sounds, not the wind in the trees or the faint scurrying of small animals. This was something deliberate, slow, methodical. I held my breath. The sound came closer, and then there was a pause, complete stillness. My heart pounded in my chest. Seconds felt like hours. Nothing moved, and then suddenly the sound was back again, closer than before. It wasn't just rustling anymore. It was a thud, a heavy step. Someone or something was moving around my camp. I forced myself to stay still, pretending to be asleep, even though I was anything but. The noise came and went for what felt like an eternity. A step here, a shuffle there, like whatever it was circling the perimeter of my campsite, testing to see if I would react. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I stayed perfectly still, heart hammering against my chest. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to grab my flashlight, to scream, to do something, but I couldn't. The darkness outside felt thick, like it was pressing against me, holding me in place. The footsteps stopped suddenly. Dead silence. My heart was in my throat. And then crack. A branch broke, loud and clear, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large moving away. The tension in my body slowly began to ease. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what just happened. I was alone, wasn't I? There were no other campers around. No one else had been in the woods all day. So why was someone or something out there? I lay there for what felt like hours, too afraid to sleep, too afraid to move. Eventually, the sounds died down and the silence returned. I forced myself to sleep, but even then, my dreams were plagued with dark, shifting shapes. I've always been the type to crave solitude, so when my friends backed out of the camping trip, I didn't hesitate. It wasn't that I didn't enjoy their company, but there was something calming about being alone in the woods. No distractions, just the wind through the trees, the sound of my own heartbeat, and the crackling of the fire. It felt like the perfect weekend getaway. I drove out to the small, remote campground, a place I had heard about through some online forums. It wasn't far from the nearest town, but it was secluded enough that I wouldn't run into many people. As I turned off the paved road and onto a narrow dirt path, the trees closed in around me. Tall pines, oaks, and maples loomed overhead, their branches twisting together, almost as if they were trying to keep the sunlight from reaching the forest floor. I parked my car near the entrance to the campsite and unloaded my gear. The air was crisp, just starting to feel like fall, and the faint smell of damp earth and pine needles hung in the air. The only sounds were the distant calls of birds and the rustle of leaves as a breeze passed through the trees. I set up my tent near a small creek that ran through the woods, hoping to be close enough to hear the calming sound of the water as I slept. As the sun began to set, I gathered some firewood and built a small campfire. The fire crackled and popped, sending a few sparks into the air. I sat down on a nearby log, staring into the flames, letting my mind wander. There was something peaceful about being out here, alone in nature. It was like the whole world faded away. But as the darkness deepened, the peacefulness of the woods began to shift. The air grew colder, and the sound of the creek became muffled under the growing chorus of night noises. Crickets chirped, owls hooted in the distance, and I could occasionally hear the rustling of something moving in the underbrush. At first, I didn't think much of it. Animals are everywhere in the woods, right? Squirrels, raccoons, maybe even a deer. But as the night wore on, the sounds seemed a little too close. The bushes rustled, twigs snapped, and I could hear something heavy moving through the woods just beyond the firelight. I chalked it up to an animal, maybe a bear or a large deer, though I had never heard anything move with quite so much weight. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. Then, there was a noise I couldn't explain. A sharp, high-pitched sound, almost like the scream of a bird, but it wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It was distant but clear enough to make me stop and listen. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and for the first time, I felt that uneasy shiver creeping up my spine. It wasn't an animal, and it definitely wasn't the wind. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, shining the beam into the trees. The light bounced off the trunks of the pines and reflected off the leaves, but there was nothing there. No animals, no movement, just the blackness of the woods. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the unease building up, but I told myself it was nothing, just some weird noise, no big deal. I sat back down by the fire, trying to calm my nerves. Maybe I was just being paranoid. After all, I'd been camping in these kinds of woods many times before, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave. The fire crackled and popped. The wind whispered through the branches, and the noise from the underbrush seemed to get closer, almost like it was circling me. I shone the flashlight in every direction, but nothing was ever there. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. I snuffed out the fire and crawled into my tent, zipping it up tightly. The darkness inside was suffocating after the warmth of the fire, but it was also comforting in its own way. The tent was small, just big enough for my sleeping bag and gear. I lay there in the quiet, the sound of my breathing mixing with the rustling of leaves outside. It wasn't long before I heard it again. A low thud, not the kind of sound an animal would make, but a heavy, deliberate thud. It came from the direction of the creek. My heart skipped a beat, and I held my breath, straining to hear any other sound that might explain it. Nothing, just the thud. A few seconds later, another one, this time closer. I didn't move. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the sound. Was it a person? Someone else out here in the woods? Or was it something worse? I didn't know, but every instinct I had told me that I should get out of here. But I couldn't. I was trapped in that small tent, and the thought of leaving it to face whatever was out there in the dark terrified me more than staying put. The thuds came again, closer. They were rhythmic now, like someone walking slowly, carefully, in my direction. My mind screamed at me to leave, but my body refused to move. My hands gripped the flashlight, and I waited, barely breathing, as the sounds grew louder. And then suddenly they stopped. I stayed still for what felt like hours, waiting for any sign that whatever it was still out there. But nothing came. The woods had returned to their usual nighttime noises, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the wind. I didn't trust it, though. Something was wrong. I lay there, wide awake, listening for any new sound, my heart racing in my chest. Eventually, I must have drifted off, exhaustion taking over. I woke up the next morning to the bright light of dawn streaming through the trees. The woods were quiet, peaceful again, but the memory of the night before clung to me like a shadow. I didn't pack up right away. The thought of leaving felt like admitting something was out there, something I didn't want to acknowledge. So, I spent the day walking around, trying to clear my mind. The sounds from the night before were still fresh in my memory, and every crackling branch or snapping twig made me jump. Around midday, I decided to take a hike down the creek. I followed the narrow path through the trees, the sound of the water growing louder as I got closer. The air felt fresher here, cooler. The creek was shallow, just a few inches deep in most places, but it flowed swiftly over smooth rocks, creating a gentle, calming sound. I walked along the creek for a while, trying to lose myself in the beauty of the forest. The sun was higher now, casting long shadows across the ground. It was hard to shake the feeling of unease that had settled in my gut, but I did my best to ignore it. Then I saw it, a footprint. It was large, the size of a boot, and it was clear that it had been left recently. The soil was still soft around the edges, the imprint sharp and defined. I crouched down to examine it, my mind racing. Whoever or whatever had left this print was close. I looked around, but the woods were silent, almost too silent. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched again. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and I stood up quickly, scanning the trees. There was no movement, no sign of anything nearby, but the sense of danger felt real now. The thuds from last night, the strange noises, everything was starting to make sense. Someone or something was out there. I didn't want to admit it, but I knew it was time to go. I turned and made my way back to camp as quickly as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached my tent, packed up my gear, and without looking back, I made my way to my car. The drive back to town was a blur. I didn't stop for anything. The woods felt oppressive behind me, and I didn't want to risk looking over my shoulder. I'd come for peace and solitude, but instead, I had found something else. Something that made me feel small and vulnerable in a way I couldn't explain. I never went back to those woods. Every time I think about it, the memory of those strange, heavy footsteps echoes in my mind, reminding me that some places, no matter how beautiful, are better left unexplored. I always liked camping alone. Something about the silence of the woods, the way the trees stretched endlessly in every direction, made me feel at peace. Maybe it was the isolation, or the way the fire flickered against the night, keeping the unknown just outside its reach. I had done it dozens of times before without a problem, but this time was different. I had picked a spot deep in the forest, away from any trails, where no one would accidentally wander by. I parked my truck a few miles back and hiked in with everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, knife, flashlight, the essentials. The first night went as expected. The wind rattled the trees, the fire crackled, and the distant sounds of wildlife played like a natural soundtrack to my solitude. The second night was when things changed. I had spent the day hiking, exploring the area, and making sure I knew my way around. When I got back to camp in the early evening, something felt off. First, I couldn't put my finger on it. Everything was exactly where I had left it. My tent was zipped up, my bag untouched, my firewood stacked neatly where I had placed it that morning. But something was wrong. It was a feeling, that deep kind of unease that you can't explain but also can't ignore. As night fell, the feeling only grew stronger. I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I was tired from the hike. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I ate dinner, made a fire, and tried to shake the feeling. But every so often, I would glance into the trees, convinced I had seen movement just beyond the fire's light. It wasn't an animal. I knew what deer looked like, how raccoons moved, how coyotes slinked through the darkness. This was different. The movement was slow, deliberate, almost cautious, like something was watching me, studying me. I told myself I was being paranoid. I had been out here before. I had spent nights alone in the woods more times than I could count. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, my gut kept screaming that something was wrong. I checked my surroundings carefully, scanning with my flashlight. Nothing, just trees, shadows, and the occasional reflection of animal eyes in the distance. But then I noticed something. The pile of firewood I had stacked earlier was different. It wasn't knocked over, wasn't scattered, but it had been moved, rearranged, subtle but noticeable. I knew for a fact I had stacked it in a certain way, and now it wasn't the same. It was a small change, but it sent a chill through my body. Someone had been here. I grabbed my knife and sat closer to the fire, every muscle in my body tense. The forest was too quiet. Even the insects had gone silent. I told myself I'd pack up and leave at first light. I wasn't going to spend another night out here. I barely slept. Every sound made my heart pound. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a branch in the distance, sent my thoughts spiraling into dark places. I kept my knife in my hand, my flashlight within reach, and waited for morning. At some point, exhaustion must have won, because I woke up to the first hints of sunlight filtering through the trees. My fire had burned down to embers, and everything around me was still and quiet. Too quiet. I sat up and immediately felt that same sense of unease, only now it was worse. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the area. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. And not just one set. Multiple. Barefoot, pressing deep into the dirt around my campsite. Some large, some smaller. They circled my tent, leading in and out of the trees. My stomach dropped. I hadn't imagined it. Someone had been here. More than one person. Watching me. I didn't waste time packing properly. I shoved what I could into my bag, threw dirt over the embers of my fire, and started moving. The hike back to my truck felt twice as long as before. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I expected to see someone standing there, just watching. I kept my knife in my hand the entire time. When I finally saw my truck, relief hit me so hard I almost collapsed. I tossed my bag into the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. But before I could start the engine, I noticed something. My driver's side door was unlocked. I never leave it unlocked. Never. My hands started shaking as I reached for the handle. Slowly, I pulled the door open and checked inside. Nothing looked disturbed. No signs of forced entry. But on the driver's seat, right in the center, was something that hadn't been there before. A single, dirty handprint. I started the engine and drove out of there faster than I ever have in my life, my heart pounding the entire way. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main road, surrounded by other cars and buildings. Only then did I start to breathe normally again. I don't camp alone anymore. I've always loved camping, but I don't think I'll ever do it alone again. It started as a solo trip to clear my head. I had been stressed from work, tired of the constant noise of the city, and I just wanted to be alone for a few days. I picked a remote spot in a national forest, miles away from any popular campsites. I wanted isolation, and I got it. The drive took most of the morning. By the time I reached the small, winding dirt road leading to the campsite, the sun was high, beating down on the trees and casting sharp shadows across the ground. The air smelled fresh, pine and damp earth mixing together in a way that reminded me why I loved being out here. I parked my truck at the edge of a clearing, grabbed my gear, and set up camp near a slow-moving creek. It was perfect, quiet, peaceful, nothing but the sounds of birds and the wind rustling the trees. I spent the afternoon gathering firewood, setting up my tent, and making sure my food was secured. I knew there were bears in the area, but I had a proper bear canister and hung up anything with a scent far from my tent. I wasn't worried. I'd done this before. I built a fire as the sun started to set, cooked a quick meal, and sat by the flames, enjoying the silence. That first night, something felt off, but I ignored it. I was alone, after all, and sometimes being alone in the woods plays tricks on your mind. You hear things you wouldn't normally notice, a distant crack of a branch, the faint rustling of leaves. I told myself it was just the normal sounds of the forest and forced myself to relax. Then, in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound outside my tent. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard something heavier. Footsteps. Not the quick, light movements of an animal, but something deliberate, slow. Human. My heart pounded as I lay still, holding my breath. I strained my ears, listening, waiting for something more, but after a few minutes, it stopped. I told myself I was imagining things, that maybe a branch had just fallen nearby or an animal had passed by. I eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, everything seemed normal. The air was crisp, the sunlight warm, and the forest felt calm. Still, something nagged at me. I checked the area around my tent but didn't see any tracks. No signs that anyone or anything had been there. I brushed it off, made breakfast, and planned a hike. I spent most of the day exploring, following a narrow trail deeper into the woods. The hike was good, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling watched, but every time I stopped, turned around, and listened, there was nothing. Just trees, the occasional squirrel darting through the underbrush, and the distant call of a bird. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was already dipping low. I built another fire, ate my dinner, and sat there, trying to enjoy the moment. But that feeling of unease never left me. I was jumpy, my nerves on edge. Every sound seemed too loud, too close. I forced myself to stay calm, to ignore the fear creeping up my spine. I reminded myself that I was in the middle of nowhere, alone. There was no reason for anyone to be out here but me. Then, just as I was getting ready to put out the fire, I heard something. It was faint, coming from somewhere deep in the trees. A whistle, a single sharp note that cut through the silence. My stomach dropped. It wasn't the sound of a bird. It was human. I stood still, my heart hammering. I didn't move. I listened, waiting, hoping I had imagined it. Then, after what felt like forever, another whistle. Closer this time. I didn't wait. I doused the fire, grabbed my flashlight, and went straight into my tent, zipping it up behind me. I sat there in the dark, gripping my knife, barely breathing. The woods were silent now, too silent. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, listening, but nothing else happened. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to the first light of dawn. I stepped outside, my body stiff from sleeping in a tense ball. The fire pit was cold, my gear untouched. Everything seemed fine, but I knew it wasn't. I packed up fast. I didn't even make breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. As I loaded my truck, I took one last look around. That's when I saw them, footprints. Not mine. They were fresh, leading from the tree-line to where I had been sitting by the fire, then back into the woods. Whoever had been watching me had come closer than I realized. I got in my truck and drove away, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on a paved road, surrounded by signs of civilization. Only then did I let myself breathe. I don't know who was out there that night. I don't know what they wanted, and I don't ever want to find out. I haven't been camping alone since. I remember everything about that night, every sound, every feeling, every single mistake I made. I was alone, deep in the woods, camping by a quiet lake miles away from the nearest town. I had done this kind of thing before, solo camping trips, just me, my gear, and nature. It was something I always found peaceful. Until that night. The drive up to the trailhead was uneventful. A few hours through winding back roads and empty highways. I parked my truck at the entrance of the trail, checked my gear one last time, and started my hike. It was about 6 miles to the lake where I planned to set up camp. The first few miles were easy. Dense trees on either side, the crunch of dry leaves beneath my boots, the distant call of birds. Felt good to be out there, away from everything. By the time I reached the lake, the sun was starting to dip below the tree line. The water was still, reflecting the deep oranges and purples of the evening sky. I set up my tent near the shore, gathered some firewood, and got a small fire going. After cooking a quick meal, I sat by the fire, watching the last bit of daylight fade. The air was cool, and the smell of pine and damp earth filled my lungs. It was perfect. Then, as darkness fully settled in, I heard something dot a branch snapping. It came from somewhere in the trees behind me. Not too close, but not far either. I turned my head sharply, staring into the darkness. The fire crackled beside me, sending small sparks into the air. I listened, holding my breath. Nothing. Probably just an animal. A deer, maybe. I shook it off and went back to tending the fire. But a few minutes later, another sound. This time, footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Not heavy, but not light enough to be an animal. I stood up, my heart pounding. My flashlight was in my tent, but I didn't want to take my eyes off the woods. I could feel something out there, watching me. My skin crawled. Then silence. The kind of silence that feels unnatural. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just dead air. I forced myself to move. Slowly, I backed toward my tent, grabbed my flashlight, and flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees. Nothing. I scanned left, then right. Still nothing. But I knew something had been there. I could feel it. I convinced myself it was just my nerves and forced myself to sit back down by the fire. But I kept my flashlight close. Hours passed. The fire burned low, and exhaustion started creeping in. I decided to call it a night. I doused the fire, zipped up my tent, and crawled into my sleeping bag. The fabric of the tent felt thin, too thin, like it couldn't keep anything out if it really wanted in. I lay there, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening. Every small sound made me flinch. The rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. But after a while, exhaustion won. My eyes grew heavy, and I drifted off to sleep. I woke up suddenly. Something was outside my tent, breathing. Slow, steady breaths, just inches from where my head was. My blood turned to ice. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. It wasn't an animal. I knew that for sure. Then a slow, dragging sound, like fingers running down the fabric of the tent. My stomach clenched. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I wanted to move, to grab my knife, but I was frozen. Then silence again. I don't know how long I lay there, but eventually, the first light of dawn started to creep through the tent. Only then did I finally move. My muscles were stiff, my body sore from staying in the same position for hours. Slowly, carefully, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. Nothing. The campsite looked the same as before. The fire pit, my gear, everything untouched. But the ground outside my tent was different. The dirt had been disturbed. Drag marks like someone had crouched there for a long time, shifting their weight. I packed up as fast as I could. Every movement felt sluggish, like I was still trapped in that fear from the night before. I didn't eat. I didn't even take a sip of water. I just stuffed everything into my pack, slung it over my shoulder, and started the long hike back. The entire time I felt it, that same feeling from the night before. Eyes on me, following, stalking. Every now and then, I would stop, turn around quickly, scanning the trees. But there was nothing, just silence. I walked faster, then faster. My heart pounded with every step. I didn't stop. I didn't rest. My only thought was getting back to my truck. When I finally saw it, sitting there at the trailhead, a wave of relief crashed over me. I practically ran the last stretch, threw my pack in the bed, and jumped inside, locking the doors immediately. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of there, gravel kicking up behind me. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back on the main road. Only then did I let myself breathe. I still don't know what was out there that night. Maybe it was just some guy messing with me. Maybe it was worse than that. I don't like to think about it, but I do know one thing. I'll never camp alone again.